Okay, calling the meeting to order. This is the City Council study session, 6:30 p.m., Tuesday, February 9th, 2021. Meeting accessibility. Pursuant to the Governor's Emergency Proclamation 20-25, the city is unable to provide an in-person location for the public to listen to the virtual City Council meeting this evening. Meetings are still accessible to the public and public comment is able to be submitted. To view live, city website www.sammamish.us/TV21, the city YouTube, and Comcast Channel 21 within Sammamish only. To view later, meeting videos are available the day after the meeting on the city website, again, www.sammamish.us/TV21, the YouTube, and Comcast Channel 21 within Sammamish only. There's no executive session, and Mike, will you call order?
Mayor Karen Moran.
Present.
Deputy Mayor Christy Malchow.
Present.
Councilmember Ken Gamblin.
Present.
Councilmember Chris Ross.
Present.
Councilmember Pamela Stewart.
Here.
And Councilmember Kent Treen.
Present.
Okay, the first up this evening, we have got discussion on the Inglewood Middle School.
Thank you. May I'll take that. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah? Oh.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you, and we see, yes, your slides.
Great. Good evening, Madam Mayor, members of the City Council, and Mr. City Manager. I'm Anjali Maya, Director of the Parks, Recreation and Facilities Department. We are here tonight to present the proposed improvements at Inglewood Middle School, as well as a draft Memorandum of Understanding between the city and the Lake Washington School District for your consideration. A feasibility study was completed early last year, and the results were presented as part of the athletic field study in 2s and 3s to City Council in May of 2020. This project was in the budget for 2019 and 2020, and subsequently in the adopted budget for 2021 and 2022. And staff have been working on it. That said, we want to acknowledge that we have heard some concerns from Council on whether the city should focus its attention on this project or on improving fields on city-owned property. We kept this topic on your agenda for a couple of reasons. One is because we had scheduled it a while ago in an effort to try and keep to the timeline of trying to build this project next year. The other reason is because we are at a good checkpoint. All we have done at this point is a feasibility study. We haven't started work on the design and permitting. So now would be a good time if Council would like staff to stop working on the project altogether, and we can just move on to the next project on the list of the Park CIP, or perhaps pause the project and have staff complete a similar feasibility exercise on a different athletic field project. We have several of our staff members in attendance tonight, including Kevin Teague, Chris Jordan, and Shelby Perrol, as well as the city's consultant, Bob Harding, Principal Landscape Architect at D.A. Hogan and Associates, and Brian Buck, Executive Director of Support Services at the Lake Washington School District. With that, I'll hand it over to Kevin to make the presentation.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Anjali, Madam Mayor and City Council. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the Inglewood Middle School field project with you and look forward to your input. We have added, just for your information, we've added some information to the PowerPoint from what was in your packet. That information was added for clarity, and we've also added a few slides so that we can talk about field usage. I'll start off with a little bit of background on the site and on the project, and then we'll talk about the preliminary athletic field design. I will then cover the preliminary project costs and funding, and then we'll talk about field usage. I will review the high points of the Memorandum of Understanding with the Lake Washington School District, and then discuss the anticipated project timeline and next steps. We'll leave time for questions at the end, but finally, we do ask for specific direction from City Council regarding the athletic field design options and looking for input on the proposed MOU with the Lake Washington School District. So just starting off with a little bit of background on the site and on the project. Inglewood Middle School was built in 1991 along with its athletic facilities. In 2004, the city and the Lake Washington School District first entered into an interlocal agreement for the shared field use. In 2005, at Englewood, the softball fields and the tennis courts were reconfigured. In 2013, a field renovation project at Inglewood Middle School was identified in our 2013-2018 Parks CIP, and then again in 2018, a project at this site was identified in our 2018 to 2023 Parks CIP as a high priority project. Additionally, in 2020, the city took on the responsibility of scheduling all of the Lake Washington School District athletic fields within the city of Sammamish. In 2014, the city and the school district entered into an ILA for joint use of athletic fields in the city. This means that the school has priority during school hours, and the city has priority on weekends and evenings. An example of this ILA in place is with the community fields at Eastlake High School. The city partnered with the school district to redevelop 3 community fields. This has proven to be a successful model where the city and the district partner to redevelop underutilized fields, and the city maintains and schedules the fields after construction. With flat land more scarce in the city, partnerships provide opportunities to expand and improve existing, developed, and sometimes underutilized athletic facilities in order to maximize use for both the schools and the community-based activities. Our 2018 Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan outlined recommendations to address increasing demands for athletic fields within the following recommendations. Continue the multi-use concept of fields. Convert as many existing fields to synthetic turf and light as many as possible. Continue to partner with the school district on improvements to existing fields and develop new ones. I'm sure we all know where Englewood Middle School is, but just to orient you, it is in the northeast section of the city. It's on the north side of Northeast 8th Street. And for context on this map, you'll see Eastlake High School in green, and then Sammamish Commons in purple there. Englewood Middle School sits on a 19.5-acre property, and in addition to the school building, the drive lanes and parking areas, there is a baseball field. There is one football field with a running track. There's a softball field, and there are 6 tennis courts. I'm going to talk a little bit about and it provides one synthetic turf field inside of a rubberized track, a 6-lane rubberized track, with markings for soccer, lacrosse, and football. This configuration plans for bleachers to accommodate approximately 150 spectators, and within that multi-purpose field, and then also sports lighting. The plan is also to include a small restroom building on the side of the field there. The school district, the track that the school district would like will be a 400-meter, 6-lane rubberized surface running track. It will have long jump, triple jump, and space for discus and shot put. However, even with these amenities, track meets are unlikely to take place here just due to overall space. Moving on to option 2. Option 2 is to relocate the track and the field to the northern portion of the site and then combine the softball and baseball fields in a larger complex. So with this option, you get 2 synthetic multi-purpose fields to accommodate football, soccer, and lacrosse. You also get the 6-lane running track that the school district is looking for, and then field lighting for all of the field space. And then a nice centrally located restroom. I'm going to zoom into the southern portion of the site. This is the multi-purpose field on the south side. You can see the rectangular overlay for soccer as well as lacrosse. In addition to that, you have a 200-foot outfield for softball with batting cages, bullpen, scoreboard, and dugouts. And then you have a 300-foot outfield baseball field with the same amenities, batting cage, bullpen, scoreboard, and dugouts. And then field lighting for both of those. I'm going to back up one second. This option is what's recommended by our Parks and Recreation Commission and is preferred by the Lake Washington School District. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the preliminary costs for each of those options. Option 1, with the one multi-purpose turf field, is estimated at about $4.3 million for the city's portion of the project. Option 2, with the expanded capacity fields, it is estimated at $10.7 million for the city's portion of the project. And just to note that these costs are based on feasibility level design and incomplete site studies. They will be updated once the studies are completed. In regard to the Lake Washington School District responsibilities, theirs are the same whether it's option 1 or option 2, and it's estimated at about $2.2 million. So moving forward with either of these options, the question is, where would the money come from? And we, in our 2019 to 2020 Park CIP budget for Englewood Middle School, there's $420,000. And then in the 2021-2022 Park CIP for Englewood is 4.8, and an additional $5 million in the athletic field projects category. This amount was reserved for a second multi-purpose field with lights at Englewood Middle School, subject to the successful negotiations of the interlocal agreement with the school district. Any remaining costs could be covered with the funds from the 2021-2022 Parks Capital Contingency Reserve. So now we want to talk a little bit about field usage, and for that, I'm going to ask Chris Jordan, our Recreation and Cultural Services Manager, to speak to this issue. Chris?
Thanks, Kevin. Good evening, Council. My name is Chris Jordan, and the Recreation and Cultural Service Manager for the city. This evening, I want to provide you with some information on usage and rentals at Englewood Middle School. I wanted to start off my portion of the presentation by giving you a layout and inventory of fields in the community. During the athletic field study, we analyzed fields owned by city, Lake Washington School District, Issaquah School District, and the community that were used by all community groups in the area. The charts above break down the fields in north and south areas of Sammamish and by specific types from synthetic turf to natural grass to sand. Next slide, please. The city currently serves several organizations and leagues at our turf and lighted community fields at Eastlake High School. The community fields are used by a variety of organizations who serve and or reside throughout Sammamish. Groups range from ISC Gunners, I-9 Sports, Eastlake Lacrosse, Sammamish Baseball Club, Lake Washington Youth Soccer, Eastlake Youth Football, and much more. Also, a good portion of these organizations are looking for additional time on turf for practices and games in the spring, summer, and fall. Next slide, please. Inglewood Middle School does offer a few outdoor sports throughout the school year. They offer cross country and tennis in the fall, soccer in late fall, early winter, and tennis and track and field in the spring. Only 2 of these sports directly use the fields, which is soccer and track and field. The community sports leagues and organizations in the area help supplement and provide sport activities that are not offered by the district at the middle school level, which includes softball, baseball, football, and lacrosse, for example. Next slide, please. Inglewood Middle School does have a current use for a few organizations. The 2 main groups are Lake Washington Youth Soccer and Eastlake Little League. Lake Washington Youth Soccer uses a football field in the fall for about 120 hours, and Eastlake Little League uses baseball and softball fields in the spring and summer for about 550 hours per field. The use is limited on these fields due to no irrigation and limited maintenance performed on natural grass fields. The chart on the screen shows possible estimated hours at Inglewood Middle School for 2 options being presented today. Option 1 could increase rental usage by 55%, and option 2 could increase rental usage by 96%. I want to thank council for allowing me to present this evening, and I would like to now pass it back to Kevin.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for that helpful overview. Now let's turn and take a look at the draft Memorandum of Understanding, and I'll go over some of the high points. The MOU spells out that the city will be the lead agency for design, permitting, and construction of the project. The city will be responsible for design and construction costs associated with the athletic fields and lighting, and the associated stormwater treatment as well as site work, and half of the restroom costs. The school district will be responsible for the design and construction costs of the 6-lane track and its associated stormwater treatment, and half of the restroom costs. And additionally, if they opt to put in a secondary bus exit on the Northeast 8th, they will bear that cost. In addition to that, the MOU outlines the need for an amendment to our existing interlocal agreement. The amendment to the interlocal agreement would have a duration of 20 years or 2 turf cycles. It would also contain a termination clause. So the termination clause would be if the district terminates the agreement prior to the 20-year or 2 turf cycle time period, they would reimburse the city a portion of the construction costs invested by the city. How that amount is determined will be agreed upon in the ILA amendment. The amendment to the ILA will also establish financial responsibilities for ongoing utility costs, stormwater, maintenance and capital replacement, as well as repairs. And then it will address operational issues such as shared use hours and field use during school events. Next, I will touch on our anticipated timeline and next steps. And this timeline is if all things go as planned, this is what we hope the timeline will be. So our feasibility is completed. We hope to start design and construction document preparation in the winter of 2021 with putting the project out to bid in the spring of 2022. And then having construction begin in the summer through the fall of 2022. Next steps, first would be to execute the Memorandum of Understanding with the Lake Washington School District, and then execute a design contract with our consultant. and then begin the interlocal agreement amendment, which we have planned for the second quarter of this year. Before I conclude my comments, I'd like to just mention the recommendations of our Parks and Recreation Commission, as well as the preferences of the school district. On March 4th in 2020, the Parks and Recreation Commission voted unanimously to recommend that the City Council proceed with the alternative field layout, which is option 2, the expanded option that I showed you tonight. And then on February 3rd of 2021, the Parks and Recreation Commission voted unanimously to recommend that the City Council execute the Memorandum of Understanding with the Lake Washington School District. The Lake Washington School District has expressed preference for the option 2 field design, and they have reviewed and approved the draft Memorandum of Understanding. So with all of that, hopefully we have addressed your concerns and provided the information that you need, and we are looking forward to your direction on this project, and specifically regarding the athletic field design options, and then any input you have on the proposed Memorandum of Understanding. So with that, I thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Okay, we got folks in the chat box. One, I'm happy to see the change from the 10-year to the 20-year. Okay, first in the chat box is Councilmember Gamblin.
Yeah, hey, thank you, Kevin. Good overview. Hey, the question I have is on dollars. So I'm wondering if this exists somewhere so we don't have to recreate it. But what I'm kind of interested in is some type of matrix that possibly can be created that shows us, excuse me, I'm going to look at my notes here. Number one, usage. So a way to break down, let's just imagine the total usage of the fields at 100%. A way to break out who's using the fields and how we anticipate them being used. So in other words, a percentage of the total field used by the middle school. A percentage of the total, and by the middle school, I also mean any other district, school district usage. A percentage of the total field used by private rentals, and a percentage of the total used by city organizations. So we'd have some idea of what percentages are we looking at on this field, on who's going to be using it, and breaking that down into, and you can do it by hours or wherever you want, as long as it comes out to 100%. And then basically the same idea with the capital expenses. So same breakout for the capital construction costs, all-inclusive planning, everything else involved with that. What are those percentages now? And I imagine for that you take out private rentals because they're not going to pay, but what's the percentage for the total amounts on capital expenses, construction costs for Englewood, for the school district, and for the city? And then the same breakout for long and short-term maintenance and repair, and the same percentage breakout for ongoing operating expenses. In other words, who's using it? How much are they using it? How much are we paying to build it? So we can compare and see what kind of equity we have. I mean, I'm all for having the school having a great field. My son went there, loved it, great school. But my main responsibility is here to the residents of the city and to make sure their interests are best represented. So I don't want to form an antagonistic relationship with the school district. I don't think we have that to begin with and don't want to form it. But I do think it would be very helpful to me to know these percentages breakouts on expected benefits versus expected expenses, both capital and ongoing, on this operating expenses on something like this. So I don't know if you've created this, and if you haven't, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on what you think something like that would look like. And if you don't have it, I'd sure be interested in seeing something like that before I can make a decision.
That's not something that we have that I'm aware of. Chris, is that anything that you have that you've worked out at this point? If not, it's something that we can work on and get back to you with.
I'll try and answer that at a high level. We obviously don't have a matrix, Councilmember Gamblin, to share right now. But the approach to this, like we mentioned before, if we put in the capital expense, one of the expenses as the land cost, then the cost of really what the district brings to the table here is the land. And we have about 8.7 acres of field. And then the parking lot is another couple of acres. And it's already improved as a parking lot. So if the matrix, at a high level, I'd say if the matrix factored in the cost of the land and the parking improvements, this would come out as fairly even. If we didn't, the city is putting in a lot of the costs we showed you today. As you saw, it's about $2 million in an investment from the district as opposed to $10.7 million from the city. So if you did not consider the land costs, the city is putting in a lot more. In terms of the usage, again, at a high level, the school and the middle school kids have access to this through the day, which we don't really have our fields at any of our parks rented through the day anyway. So the use that the city would get out of it would be after school hours. But there we did show you where the school has some of its activities that go on till about 5:30 in the evening. Now, again, school is out for summer. A lot of the leagues play in the summer. So obviously a matrix would share a lot more specifics. But anyway, that's a response at a high level. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and Jalia, I appreciate those thoughts and understand your thought process there. Quite frankly, the school district already owns the land. It's not an expense for them, and they're going to own the land after the project is completed. So they're going to continue with that benefit no matter what. It's not dollars that they're putting into it at this point. So again, they already have the benefit of that. They own that land. They're going to continue to own that asset out into the, obviously, probably forever or into the foreseeable future. So, and I guess I got part of my answer answered is this is 100% being funded by the city. And maybe I'm not as familiar with how the school districts and the city work together on capital improvements to school district properties. I mean, is it fairly common for municipalities to come in and pay 100% to create this asset for the use of the basically, and I don't know what the percentages are. I'd be very interested to see that for the use of the school district. Again, I understand the kids going to the school district are residents' children, so I don't want to sound hard-hearted here. But again, this is a real chunk of dollars, and my mind goes to it seems to me it's being funded almost totally by the city. But again, and I will look for my other council members' input on this if they have an interest. If they have no interest in seeing these numbers, if they already figured this out, then obviously I don't have to have the time spent. But if any of my other council members have an interest in a little bit of question on equity in usage, equity on expense, equity on maintenance and repair, equity on operating expenses, I didn't see any of that in the MOU. I have a high level of interest in it. And right now it seems, the school district is giving the land, but they already gave it. They already own it. And they've owned it for a long time, and they're going to continue to. So, again, I would have a question with that, and I'd be interested in my fellow council members' input if they have an interest in seeing those numbers broken out. I'm finished. Thank you so much.
Okay, next is, well, one I know I'd like to see some numbers, but next is Councilmember Treen.
Yeah, I agree. I'd like to see some numbers too, Ken, on that part. Councilmember Gamblin. And I don't know if somebody knows this or not. So the first question that came to me when I read the packet, even back when we first got it, and I looked at it, and was have the residents of Sammamish voted already this down? And when I say that, what I mean is when the bond came up for Lake Washington School District to improve capital facilities, that bond didn't pass. And and I don't know if that was because it was all of Lake Washington School District, therefore it didn't pass. And where does the Sammamish residents fall on that particular vote? Were they in support of it, capital improvements for the school, or were they also against the capital improvement? Because then that would give me an indication of where the residents, where their mind is and their thoughts are on this project. So, and Kevin or Anjali, I don't know if you, or Chris Jordan, I don't know if you have those numbers, or if the city manager and their staff would be able to find that out for us, or if some survey went out. Anyways, I would be curious just to know if our residents are they in support or are they not in support of spending their tax dollars already on this site. So that's my first kind of like just overall impression of the thing as looking at this project. The second thing that I looked at, and Mayor Moran mentioned this, she liked the idea of the 20-year, that this is over a 20-year period, 10-year things. When, like Anjali or Kevin Teague, when you read that MOU and that section, what is your understanding of what that legally means? A minimum of 10 years or through the life cycle of the synthetic turf, whichever occurs first. So can you explain, because then we'd have to replace it, and then we renegotiate. Well, we negotiate, it seems like, a cost to who's going to pay to replace that. And then we get another 10 years.
Correct.
Or through the cycle of the synthetic turf, whichever occurs first. So what do you understand?
Go ahead, Kevin, were you going to answer that?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the intent is for as close to 20 years, and the way that the lifespan of a turf field, the turf itself before the turf needs to be replaced, not the whole prism, but the turf is about 10 years. So the intent is that it would go as close to 20 years as possible.
And if the turf was to last longer than, say, the first turf you lay out lasts longer than 10 years?
Well, the intent is that the agreement would go for 20 years, and then we would have the opportunity to renegotiate that or extend that the amendment to the interlocal agreement. And we do have Brian Buck on the line from the school district if he would like to address that. But that's the intent and where we landed. Brian, do you want to add anything?
Sure. Only that the synthetic surface is usually warranted for 8 years with an expected life of 10 years. On rare occasions, it does exceed 10 years, but generally we plan as a life cycle for 10 years for synthetic surface. Bob Harding, the architect from D.A. Hogan, is also on if he wants to comment.
Thank you, Brian. And that would be very typical of a time frame for a turf replacement cycle. The warranty, the turf, as Brian says, the turf is warranted for 8 years. And we're seeing typical 10 plus years of life of fields in this sort of application.
So my question then is kind of like, and it can be to any of you guys who are the school, I'd be interested to hear from the school district actually, is because if the city were to go with option 2 and spend $10 million plus, it would seem that that if I'm negotiating this deal, I want the longest amount of life. So my thinking was, would the school district be okay if we took a position that we want the longest amount of life? So the wording in this would be different, in that if the field lasted 12 years, we get 12 years, then we negotiate after that for the second one. So instead of a minimum of 10 years, or as close as Mr. Teague said, as close to 20 years as we can get, I'm looking at, well, why don't I just get 2 cycles of the field, which may get me 24? It may only get me 20. It may get me 19, but I'm only going to get 19 or 20 if I go the way it's written. So would the school district be interested in would it be open to the idea of extending this even longer than 20 years, and that it actually is a minimum of 20 years, but could go as long as the life of 2 cycles of the field? Now you have my attention.
Yeah, so yes, that's the intent of the language, is to last the life cycle of the turf. Just one thing is we're always watching the condition and safety of the surface itself, and so we don't generally push it beyond its limits. We replace it when it's needed to be replaced. And just generally, that's 10 years, but certainly if it lasted 11, we would support it through the life cycle. The intent is to have the agreement last the life cycle of the turf.
And then what about if the condition, like if science improves turf fields, synthetic turf fields, and we come 11, I'm going to use your number 11 because I like that number better than 10. If we get a better quality synthetic field that now is guaranteed for 10 or 12 years, is the school district at that point? Here's what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid of being stuck at 20 years, right? Because it's $10 million, it's $11 million. So that's $500,000 a year for 20 years. So if it goes 24, that cuts the taxpayer's expense over time. It just drops it so it's more manageable, more reasonable. So I think I've got my answer, and I think you understand where I'm coming from as a council member, is that though I do like the 20-year, I just also realize the way it's written to stand up in court, it benefits the school district more than it benefits the residents of Sammamish. So I would suggest that our staff and Anjali, city manager, that you might want to work with the attorney to rewrite that part of the MOU, and I think then you might have a council member who would support this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so next up we've got Deputy Mayor.
Great, thank you. So I have a few questions, and then I'll kind of walk through some of my other thoughts. First, the agenda bill mentions irrigation in the bid. Why are we putting in irrigation when we're putting in a turf field?
So, Kevin, I can address that. Again, thank you, council members. Under every situation, there is still a need for some level of water for cleanup and for maintenance of the turf. So this is not a spray system like you would see on a natural turf, where there's regular inches of water being applied to try to maintain a natural turf. This is simply there for cleanup. So water availability for cleanup in case something gets spilled on the field. If someone were to get sick, the normal protocol would be to clean that up and flush water through it. It's more for maintenance than anything else.
Okay, and who bears that cost of the water? The district?
Well, that would be part of the athletic field, and so therefore it would be our understanding is it would be the city's cost. It's factored into the city's costs.
Okay. So I think along similar lines of what Councilmember Gamblin was asking, my interest is in the true community use that would be rendered from these fields. Anjali, I know you mentioned that typically we don't program our fields in the middle of the day, but if the school is in session, that renders those fields unavailable to the general public, where in a regular park, it doesn't. So there's a difference there in being able to just get on the fields. During school hours, it's kind of locked down and no one has access to it. So I am interested, again, in what is the true, community use that will be yielded from this investment that we would potentially be making. And Anjali, you also mentioned the number of acres that this is. I'm interested in how many acres in Beaver Lake. And when I say that, and you may not have that top of mind. That park is clearly much larger, but obviously not all of it is usable for field use. So I'm kind of more honed in on the field side from Beaver Lake Park. So if you could ascertain that information, that would be helpful. And so I think my overarching on first blush with this, I appreciate the fact that staff is pulling this project out of our pro plan, and the list that is generated in these projects, and Anjali, thank you for sending that over email earlier today. But my concern is on the costs. So if you look at the costs that are adopted into our pro plan on the 6-year total, we have for Englewood Middle School $3.2 million. And here we're talking about 10.7. And that's on the high end. If we went with option one, it would be 4.3, but there's still a $1.1 million delta there between these two costs. And the pro plan is not a stale plan. It's 2 years old. I mean, 3 if you want to call it 2021. We didn't adopt it in January. So these numbers are really off, and I find that to be concerning to the extent that I would ask staff to please go back on these projects, especially those that are listed on the A category, which were the highest spend priority, and tell us really what are the costs here. Because the next project down from Inglewood is the Beaver Lake athletic fields and adding turf and lights there to the tune of $3.5 million. Well, if we're talking about, a difference of $7.5 million on Pine Lake or at Inglewood Middle School, I'm going to assume a similar delta between what the project will be at Beaver Lake. And so we start magnifying this problem of dollars. And my concern is we move forward with this particular project, that we are really carving into our ability to do any further projects of magnitude, especially Beaver Lake. And I like the idea of doing Beaver Lake in advance of doing Englewood because of the cost, which I assume is going to be around $10 million as well, frankly. Maybe it'll be a little bit less, but I would like to know some actuals. I mean, we have historically been given plans, whether it be transportation or parks, and they're really far off from what the reality ends up being. And I think at this point, these numbers are kind of back of the napkin anyway. We haven't gotten into any of the technical, engineering to really know what the cost is. So I'm going to go on the assumption that these numbers are only going to go up. I doubt they're going to go down. So I think I would ask that we understand what is the reality of our 6-year capital improvement projects, because the real conversation that I think council should be having now is not, do we do this project? It's which of these projects can we actually afford before we have a conversation with our taxpayers that talks about a lid lift or a parks levy or something of the like, because at some point in the future on this 6-year CIP, we're going to have to start picking projects that we can and cannot afford. And I think it's also worth mentioning that council members have mentioned before that we may not want to split our REIT in half anymore, and we may want to divert some of it away from parks to road projects. And if that were to happen, that further diminishes the revenue sources that we have available for our parks. So I think, we need to have a little bit of a come to Jesus on our CIP project here and decide what can we really afford without going out to our taxpayers. And that was part of the Pro Plan too, right? I mean, it talks in Appendix G about that very thing, but we've never had that conversation. So I don't want to go and overspend by $7.5 million on one of these projects before we start having a real conversation about what we can afford, what are our taxpayers willing to, saddle themselves with as far as, potential, tax burden. And frankly, I'd rather go out to our taxpayers and ask those questions about what do you want? Do you want this park? And if so, then you'll need to vote for a parks levy. So I think if we can get a better sense of the true cost, and I think, we're trying to start to do this on some of our road projects to really kind of get those down to a more realistic number rather than these back of the napkin things, because, I'll use Issaquah Falls City Road as an example. When that thing first was stuck on our TIP, the full meal deal for both phase 1 and phase 2 was like $14 million. And now we're at phase 1 and we're at $24 million. So I want to have more realistic numbers if we can get those before I'm going to be willing to make any decisions on what we kind of go forward with and what we don't.
Right. And all good points. And, we have attempted to get a little more realistic on the numbers. I think if you're looking at the Pro Plan dollar amounts where you see the 3.2, those were a lot of, just looking at a color, like at an aerial drawing, we had a dollar amount and we might have applied 5% per year because it's really hard to go back and do the costs on a really long list of projects. But this time around, when we worked on the CIP last year, we realized that that's becoming an issue on a lot of the projects and some of the bigger ones in particular. And since we had worked a bit on the athletic field study, we did try to get a little closer on the numbers. So that's how we got to what Englewood, what one field would cost at Englewood. So if you look at the CIP, not in the Pro Plan, but the one that was presented at the meeting in August of last year, the 6-year CIP, it has very different dollar amounts. I think the fields at Beaver Lake were a lot more, and several of the other athletic field projects have several more million attached to them. And then that one would give you a more realistic view. If you were within the 6-year period to build both the option 2 at Englewood and the adopted master plan at Beaver Lake Park, we wouldn't have the funds for both. So to your point, decide which one you want to build first is important. The other way would be to, delay one of the projects out of the 6-year CIP until there are adequate funds to build it.
Yeah, I mean, I recognize that we have a dire need in Sammamish for more fields. I just think that we need to have a better understanding of costs so that we can, and I appreciate that they're probably based more in reality for this project, but it leaves some of those other ones kind of out there. And, maybe the next time this comes back to council, you can embed links in the agenda packet back to the latest CIP. It kind of gives a more holistic picture for council as well as, our general public as to the magnitude of some of these projects. Because if we do have to go out and ask our residents to tax themselves for parks, I think they need to understand, the why and be able to go back and reference them and look at things like our CIP to understand kind of what I'm looking at here, which is not in the packet.
I think, Bob, did you want to respond to the costing?
Yes, I'd be happy to do. I think one thing that perhaps I can add for clarity here, council member, is that this site and the improvements were subject to a specific feasibility study where our firm was retained to come up with the options that are presented to you. To that end, we did go to a more extensive evaluation of costs as part of that conceptual design, including meeting with city staff, both in the Parks Department and down in the Planning and Public Works Department, to get a more accurate pulse of what the actual scope of improvements are going to be, as well as their associated costs. So I feel quite confident that the cost estimate and the costs that are presented here as part of development are accurate to construction costs that would occur within the time frame of the project. So it isn't what do I think it's going to cost in 6 years as part of a CIP. This is what I believe the cost of the proposed improvement is as presented to you.
Sure, and I understand that. I'm trying to frame this against the other projects and what their true costs will be. That level of detail we don't have, and that's why my concern as a council member is saying yes to this project, thinking we'll be able to say yes to everything, and knowing that will not be the reality based on how much more expensive this project is now that we've kind of gotten into the nitty-gritty details. I think every project that we have on our CIP is going to be more expensive than what we think it will be. And then we start to run out of money for the CIP projects, and then council needs to have a discussion and say, okay, well, are we doing all these projects? Are we going to prioritize these projects? Are we going to go out to our voters and ask for more money from them so that we can complete the CIP? So that's why I was kind of asking the cost questions. It's not this one in particular, but I'm betting this one's going to be more expensive too. But it's the other projects that we haven't kind of really gotten into the weeds on that I'm betting will be significantly more expensive than what's at least stated in our CIP.
Deputy Mayor, do you have any other questions? Nope. Okay. Okay, then next I have Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, thank you, Anjali and everyone. Thanks for the presentation. I just want to ask a couple of questions. One, when you did the pro plan, it's my understanding that there was significant community outreach as part of putting that together. I remember reading through, that was one of the first things that as a new council member, I think Councilmember Ross and Mayor Moran and I got to review and vote on when we joined the council. So if you could talk a little bit, maybe help Councilmember Treen understand what kind of community outreach was done and what we heard from the residents specific to parks and fields. I think that would really help.
So there's a lot of information. Sorry, go ahead. Kevin, did you want to?
No, I was just going to ask you to go ahead with this.
Yeah. There is a lot of information in the pro plan, and I won't profess to remember specifically, which parts go to what the response was, but we have several, appendices in the pro plan. One of them is just the, a statistically valid survey. In that, the fields were reasonably high, but not that high. Then you go and reach out to the sports groups and you find out how much they are lacking. And so there's, it made it, what I can say is that the final key project recommendations ranked sports fields really high. But there are several sources, several data points when you do a pro plan. And so I won't be, able to specifically point to where it says how many fields are needed. And then one of the things that came out of that is, okay, we know we need many more fields, but where can we go and increase capacity? And that was a question from council to go back and then do the athletic field study to dive into what do we have out there today and which are the fields that we can increase capacity. And Inglewood Middle School ranks high in that because we aren't using it to its full potential today, the way it is.
Great. Thanks for that. And I think, that's where I'm coming from, just looking at, I guess one of the other questions, and Deputy Mayor kind of referred to this, but I'd be curious to know how much do our fields get used during the school day when schools are in session, our community fields, because I recognize that there may be, I don't see it as a concern, but I hear from other council members there's a concern that by improving the school fields, that means that only the kids at the school can use those fields during a school day when school is in session, and the rest of the community can't. I would kind of flip that around and say, if you've ever had a kid in middle school, gym is one of their requirements, and they try to take the kids outside unless there's, a tsunami going on outside. They send the kids outside. So having decent fields for them to use, my sense is that improving these fields will give a huge value to a large number of residents, even during the school days while schools are in session. But it would be interesting to know, how often are the fields being used at Beaver Lake Park, in the middle of a Tuesday in February. I'm guessing not a lot, but let's get the data and then we don't have to guess. I do want to reiterate that the kids attending Englewood Middle School are, 90% residents, if not higher, of Sammamish. So those kids using those fields all day long during the school day are residents, and they are getting usage out of those. I'm all in favor of, investing our dollars in whatever gives our residents sort of more field time per dollar. And so what I really liked was the chart that you had that showed that we would effectively double the field time with option 2 versus what we have today at Inglewood. And I think that that's a really important piece of information to look at. I understand Councilmember Gamblin wanting some more data. I do have a little bit of confusion between what's a private rental versus a city organization, because we don't have city-sponsored sports leagues or whatever. So I think that it's really the school district use versus all the other usage. I don't think there are really 3 categories there. I think there are just the 2. And I think that's, again, it's an interesting number. I don't know how much that will determine, kind of which way we go. I think it's really looking at, in my mind, the best value for our residents is the field time per dollar, and where does that make sense to put it. And that's why I think, in doing all these evaluations that you reviewed with us earlier in 2s and 3s, this was high on the list because we get a lot more ability to use fields, reconfiguring this. Not to mention the fact that the north end, the kids at Inglewood, that track is abysmal. If you've ever tried to do any sort of track and field events, the dirt track is tough. And again, middle school students who take gym class, they're all required to run the mile, right? So they do that several times during their gym class. So they're out there running in muddy track. So I think there's a lot of value there. It sounds like one of my questions was, what did the Parks Commission recommend? It sounds like they unanimously recommended Englewood option 2. Is that correct? I think you showed that.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, so our Parks Commission, I'm assuming, dove even deeper into this, and they all came back and said this is, a really optimum place for us to invest our money in terms of the value back to our residents. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then I think, personally, I think we need to, not overstudy things. I think it's good to have data. I'm not exactly sure why we're going back to second guess some of these prioritizations now. Kind of like with some of our road projects, my understanding is that construction inflation is a pretty high number. So every time we push this out another year, the costs will just keep going up. Is that also an accurate statement?
Yes. Yeah, probably.
And do we know what the inflation for construction is? Is it still like 8.5%? I think that's what it was a couple of years ago.
I don't know that. Bob, do you have a number?
We're working right now with about a 3 to 4% cost increase per year, primarily because a lot of the cost here, which is the synthetic turf and the track, don't really expand, and they're not going up the same rate as other things. So things that are outside of our control certainly are going up faster, such as steel and some labor rates, particularly for fencing. Those are accelerating costs, and we kind of have no control over cost of steel because of imported imports and export tariffs and things like that.
Got it. So even at like a 4% increase, that starts to get up there on a per year basis. So part of me says, I appreciate that, we need to be thinking about how we fund all of this, but we do have funds sitting in our budget right now. We do have needs and demands for fields. I would say in the era of COVID, the more we can have outdoor activities for people to do, the better. We're all wanting to be able to be outside, particularly in the winter, so the more we can have fields that are able to be used even in the rainy months, I'm all for that. So I think this is great. I love the work you guys have done. I think that, let's get moving on this and let's get some fields out there. Let's get the improvements. I'm optimistic that we will find ways to fund Beaver Lake as well, but I think that this project gives us more additive field time. These will also be lighted fields, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And there's no, I'm assuming that there's no controversy over lighting these fields like we have in some of our other parks?
Part of the process will be public outreach on the lighting. So while we hope not, that's not confirmed yet.
Okay. So I think that to me would probably be the biggest question mark, because if we can have these as lighted fields, then I think that, again, just increases the value to the community. We get fields during the day for the school kids. We get fields all evening for whoever's activity is, whether it's a school practice or whether it's a community sports organization. Those are all residents getting to use those fields. And I think that's what we need to keep in mind. I appreciate that the school district owns the property. They currently own it. They'll continue to own it. But there's no way that we could go buy that many acres of flat land and build those fields on our own and add that amount of field usage on our own. So I think having these joint ventures where we work in partnership with the school districts, because again, these are all our residents. I love that. The school district, we are not paying 100% of this. I saw $2.147 million, I think was the number that the school district will be putting towards this. So that does contribute. That's a couple $1 million that we don't have to pay. And I think that that's great. So I'm loving this. I hope that we can move forward quickly and get some additional fields brought online for our community. It is a challenge. My kids aren't in community sports anymore, but when they were, I was actually the chief umpire for East Lake Little League for a year, and I can tell you that scheduling of fields was a full-time job. It took forever. Whenever there was rain, we spent so much time having to rearrange, not because it was raining too hard to play, but the fields weren't in a condition that were playable. And that wreaks havoc not only on the volunteers running those sports organizations, but on the families having to constantly reschedule those games. So I'm all in favor of this. I really appreciate the work you've done here.
Councilmember Stewart, would you like Chris Jordan to respond to your questions about field usage during the school day?
Yes, that would be awesome.
Chris, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. So the field usage during the day, we kind of can't track. For our natural fields, like our city-owned, we only rent through March through October, but we know that people use the fields during the day. They come, they drop in. People even come with their dogs and stuff. So I think with the school, it's a little different with the schools is we can't get on the fields till 5:30, where we do have some user groups starting at 4:30 at our city fields. You also have to keep thing that we do get to use 8 to 9 at East Lake Community Fields, and also would be for Englewood, we could do all summer. We get to rent it out just like we do with our city fields. So just during school hours, there probably wouldn't be any kind of drop-in use like they do with our city fields, but that's kind of the limited on that. Hopefully I answered that right for you.
Yeah, I think the main point there is that while there's no drop-in usage, you've got, 1,100, 1,200 kids at Inglewood who are using those fields all day long. And so they're probably going to get a lot more usage at the school than our fields do for drop-in in the middle of the school day.
Yeah, because we do a lot of camps at our city fields, even community fields during the summer, which would be also a place for Inglewood too. So.
Exactly. Okay, great. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, next I've got Councilmember Ross.
Thank you, Mayor. My first reaction on this is, how does this compare to the amenities of other middle schools in our area? It feels like we're making this far greater in development than the other comparables. And that's my first concern. Are we diverting resources to Englewood Middle School and at an opportunity cost of other investments for the parks and for field usage? The other part of this is I feel like the ILA is not my favorite arrangement because it feels like I'm a tenant or doing tenant improvements. At the end of the ILA, whenever that is, those improvements revert to the owner of the land. And so we may not have full control. And trust me, 10, 20 years goes very quick in the life cycle. And so we don't have full control over our future usage of our investment. And the other part is it's hard for me. It's hard for me to look at this without also looking at Beaver Lake side by side as an option. Because I do think we're putting too much money forward in this option too, in particular, and taking it away from alternative investments like Beaver Lake. Plus, Deputy Mayor mentioned we have transportation projects and may divert more of our REIT towards transportation. So we really need to be prudent in making the right choices to maximize our field usage. And without considering Beaver Lake as an option, and that would be could be a super crown jewel for the community for lifetime usage, and it'll be ours. And we can control the schedules, and we control the capacity, the scheduling, even rent it and earn revenue on it. So I'm really disappointed that we keep putting this ahead of Beaver Lake or not considering it side by side as an option. So I could definitely not make a decision on this. Right now it's no until we do that, until we look at Beaver Lake. See, that's about my main comments. Of course, costs are going up and down. And frankly, if Beaver Lake is more costly, we got to really look at ourselves. Are we being penny wise and pound foolish? Let's make the right decision for the long term for our community. And sport fields is important, and the utilization of them is important, and we need to secure the best option.
Okay, thank you.
Would you like Brian Buck? Councilman Ross, Brian Buck can respond to how this would compare with other middle schools.
Yeah, so as it relates to the Lake Washington School District middle schools, our standard is what you currently see at Englewood Middle School, with the exception of now the synthetic surface on the running track. Recently, the availability of cinders isn't what it used to be, so we've upgraded our standard to a synthetic track. But a natural grass football field, we no longer have baseball and softball fields as part of our standard at middle schools. As it relates to neighboring school districts in Sammamish, I believe Pine Lake Middle School and Beaver Lake Middle School have multiple synthetic surface fields on their campuses.
Councilmember Ross, did you have any other questions?
Yeah, as a follow-up, we may want to consider a much lower, even lower than option one look, because I don't know if there's any lights on some of those synthetic turfs. I don't think they are. Look at the lowest cost alternative to address some of Councilmember Stewart's concerns about usability of the facilities. There may be an option for us to provide some improvement maintenance at a much lower cost and still have an ILA in place to allow some usage of that as a trade-off. But the amount of investment I'm seeing is diverting scarce funds away from what could be a community facility potential at Beaver Lake.
Okay, thank you. Okay, finally I get to comment. Okay, well, first of all, I wanted to say that the lack of ball fields have been an issue since years back, 20 years ago when I was on the Parks Board. So they've been studying this for years and years and years. And I think we benefit greatly by partnering with the school districts. That being said, I think that if anybody's looking at, I looked at the new census numbers that have come in. We continue to be a bedroom community, and we are continuing to draw young families with lots of kids to percentages greater than Issaquah and Redmond. So we are a true bedroom community. So we need to focus on things for the kids, and things such as ball fields and stuff like that. That's something that is something that I think we need to make sure that we have available for the kids. That being said, and I'm going to switch to my other side of this, which is that we need to also be respectful that our job is to not only make sure that we get the biggest bang for our buck, because it's our job to not only make sure that we, it's not our job to make sure, that, yes, that there's stuff for the kids to use during the day. That's the school district's job. Our job is going in there and seeing how we can get the biggest bang for our buck for the kids after school and on the weekends and stuff like that. So that is where we come in. So those are two separate things as I see them. And I want to make sure in my mind that I keep those separate, because those are two different pots of money that, we can't start taking on other people's responsibilities. And so that leads me to my next point, which leads me to Mr. Councilmember Gamblin's, where we need to start looking at the numbers. It would be helpful if we had the numbers to look at to see, the percentages of kids, the numbers, the hours used, and that sort of thing. I do think we need to do something at the school. Something should have been done at that school. If I could have, something would have been done at that school 20 years ago. Those kids run in that mud, and it's awful. I would love to do something there ASAP. Now, whether it should be a $10 million project, I don't know that. I do know that we should do something there to utilize those fields. So, but I can't make a decision without knowing a little bit better of, and have a little bit better of an understanding of the usage numbers. And so, that would be, to me, I can't make that decision without having those numbers, that, Councilmember Gamblin discussed. But I do think that working with the district, I think that is a very smart way to go. And I don't think there's any comparison with Beaver Lake. I think that's a completely different project. And I think that I don't want to in any way say that one is off the table because of the other. They're completely different types of projects in my mind. Okay, so I'm all done with my comments and soapbox. So we are back to Councilmember Gamblin.
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of what I was thinking when I put my name in the queue has been covered. But again, I just want to put out there a little more strongly, I don't know how it became a city's responsibility to build ball fields for the school district usage. So maybe at some point someone can explain that to me, how city residents are funding school and improvement for a school district. I thought those improvements happened through bond issues through the school district. They took care of that. If there's a bad field there, and it's been bad for years, again, school district puts the money out there. They go for a bond. People raise their hands, so they want to spend the money. School district prioritizes that, and they get a new field. if we want to look at some type of cost sharing, because the district comes around and says, hey, look, you guys can use this in the evening. You can get a certain level of benefit. Great. As Mayor Moran just say, if you want to work together and get some synergy going, that's fantastic. But I'm here to represent the residents of the city and to be responsible fiscally for what's happening. And I don't see the city of Sammamish walking in and buying a new field and spending $10 million when it's the school district's responsibility, in my opinion, maybe I'm wrong, the school district's responsibility to do that. So I would like to see some much more equitable distribution of costs. The school district coming in and saying, hey, we'll pay half or we'll pay 3/4, commensurate with the amount of usage that the field will get and the benefits that will be assigned between the residents and students of the school district. And I'll leave it at that for future discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Council member, Deputy Mayor.
Great, thank you. So I just wanted to touch on a few things. And one is anytime we talk about lights, it will be controversial for the residents that are probably in the vicinity. And I think it would be good for folks to know that 240th, which is what backs right up to where the track is and where the lights are, is due to be redeveloped. So you're going to have brand new houses right there. Just as an FYI, I think the folks that are on Northeast States Place are likely to be impacted as well. I'm not saying that you don't put in lights just because of that factor, but there are residents that will be impacted not only from a light pollution standpoint, but also a noise pollution standpoint when you're talking about having lit fields later in the day. I think it's somewhat unavoidable no matter what we do. When we talked about this in Klahani, we heard about it from the Klahani residents there. We will hear about it from the residents here as well. And when we're talking about, turf and lights, that is the project for Beaver Lake as well, just so everyone's aware that it is turf and lights. The difference between Beaver Lake and this is that the lights are would be so much further recessed from where there are any homes. And so that's why I think this project is a little bit more desirable, Beaver Lake, in terms of if you had to choose between putting lights up somewhere, it's more insulated from houses, and therefore it would be better from a light and noise pollution standpoint. It was brought up that Pine Lake and Beaver Lake both have turf fields. I think Pine Lake might have lights. I don't know if Beaver Lake does, but I do think it's worth pointing out that the city of Sammamish did not contribute to those fields. That was done by the Issaquah School District, and that is a big difference. And I think that goes to what Mayor Moran and both Councilmember Gamblin were saying, which is, the taxpayers in that district chose to tax themselves in order to put those facilities in. And I'm not saying that we can't or shouldn't necessarily do it here, but we just heard that the standard for the Lake Washington School District, this would be a huge upgrade. And while the district is saying they're going to come forward and pay for the track portion, the numbers that we're looking at here tonight are our portion. So they are still fairly significant. And I think the reason that I really want to know about the Beaver Lake cost is that the option 1 versus option 2 is a really significant leap in dollars. And you're talking about turfing one extra field at Pine Lake Middle School and a huge difference in cost. Well, I'd rather turf one field at Englewood and go with option 1, get something in there, and then still have enough money left over to potentially do the project that we have at Beaver Lake, just because I think that's a better place to put in lights. This will be controversial. Make no mistake, people nearby will be upset. I think we can do what we can in terms of using the best lighting so that it is, downward facing and we don't have as much light pollution. But it is unavoidable because noise pollution will be an issue as well. So that's all I had, Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, thank you. Really quickly, first of all, I meant to mention last time and forgot, I am absolutely not in favor of redirecting our REIT away from parks. Parks are such a huge part of our city. They are heavily used. They are highly desirable. They are a gem, if you ask me, for our city. And to even have a discussion of defunding our parks, I'm just fundamentally opposed to that. As far as Beaver Lake and Pine Lake Middle Schools, their facilities are significantly better than Inglewood. What usage, Anjali, do we get on Pine Lake and Beaver Lake Middle Schools from a city being able to, rent those out to the community?
So we don't have current information on those two fields because we don't schedule them. So the community still uses them. But it's the school district that makes it available, so they would have data. If Chris Jordan, if you have anything that you know about how much those fields are used, if you can chime in here.
Yeah, so I think the spring and fall, most of the groups that use it is going to be their Skyline Youth Football, then Skyline Lacrosse use a lot of those Pine Lake and Beaver fields, the turf ones. And of course, Memphis League and some of the select teams use the baseball fields. But yeah, they the district does all the scheduling for those parts. So.
Okay. So I think those would be numbers that would be interesting to see because again, I don't look at this as it's the city's responsibility to build these fields or it's not. I look at it as how do we find the most valuable partnerships in providing value to our residents and meeting our residents' needs. So when you look at the north end of the city, where else in the north end of the city are we going to add fields? I mean, honestly, like you show me where you can add a baseball field in the north end of the city, a turf field, other than Englewood. I mean, it would be great if we had an option at the north end of the city to add turf fields anywhere else, but I don't think that we do. So I don't know that I look at it so black and white or cut and dry about whose responsibility it is. I think it's our responsibility. Like the Scouts, they called in last week and they asked, how are we working with the school districts? And our response was, we're not. It's not our responsibility. I think we best serve our community when we work together with all of the agencies that serve our community. So I really like the idea of us trying to find these partnerships to add the most value. And I will point out that at East Lake, we already have a lighted stadium, and so I'm not sure how much different it's going to be having some lighted fields over at Englewood from a noise pollution perspective. There may be some additional light pollution, but I think that the noise at the stadium, which is really pretty much just across the street, isn't going to be that different. But I think that kind of outreach will be very interesting. So again, I have faith that the staff will go back and help us kind of come up with some figures to figure out what the best value is for our community in terms of prioritizing which projects we do. I'll also point out that I don't love having to spend a lot more money, but when you look at it over the course of 20 years, and we look at the difference in the price tags, I recognize that it's a much bigger price tag, but having those turf fields for 20 years, again, that's just, it's kind of a big deal, and we don't have a lot of other options. So I think we have to take a longer view, and sometimes it's a little bit painful when we have to write some of those big checks, but this is, as Mayor Moran pointed out, people asking for more fields has been going on in the city for a really long time. And so I really appreciate staff's efforts to find ways to add field time for the community. And I think that's what we really need to stay focused on, and not so much is it the school, is it us, it's how do we partner, how do we add the most value for the community. And please do get us some more fields. The kids will not only enjoy it and benefit from it, but sometimes it's a safety issue too. Some of those fields get pretty scary over time when there's a lot of water and stuff, and there's a lot of twisted ankles, and there's a lot of balls that bounce in ways that nobody was expecting because it gets challenging with the weather that we have here. So again, I appreciate all this work, and I hope we can find a way to add fields and to do it quickly. Thanks.
Councilmember Treen.
Anjali, I just wanted you to know, and Mr. Teague, that I did read the pro plan, and I did see all the input that the residents put into My question was that, and similar to our, since others have referred to our transportation stuff, our transportation master plan, we went out and did a whole bunch of public involvement, find out what was the needs, but we didn't put any price tags to those. And so my question is, when you went out on the pro plan and put out the needs for the city, did we put price tags on those projects when we sought resident input?
As to what some of those improvements might cost?
Correct.
I believe our statistically valid survey had a lot more open-ended questions. Unlike transportation, which is going to tell you, improve Sahali Way or improve the Parkway, it's more, do you need more fields? It didn't get as specific as do you want the fields at Inglewood to be improved.
So then you can understand my position when I first was talking to you about when a number was actually placed on improving or capital improvement on the school districts. The residents of Lake Washington School District made a vote. Whether it was for or against, that's not even what I really care about. What I would care about is the number of Sammamish residents who voted during that bond. Did they vote to spend the money to improve the school district and, in a sense, to improve this field? So if that was not clear from my first conversation, I just wanted to clarify that I'm very much aware of the input and the needs. So I've done my homework that way. The second is there's no one who is wanting to defund the parks. Everything we're talking about here is how to fund parks and get more fields. It is a matter of where you would want those fields to be built. I believe then, and Anjali, you can correct me here, but I would believe that it would be, the question is, who controls the scheduling of those fields and for how long? Is that right? Is that kind of what this discussion is about and why we're looking at Englewood Middle School as one option, and that we have a list of resident input on other parks that also can be improved? Isn't that what we're looking at?
So actually, I don't know if I'm going to answer it in a different order, but we have two districts that are doing things differently, right? So if you go back 10 years, we had an agreement that was identical with the Issaquah School District and the Lake Washington School District, and that is how the fields were improved at Skyline High School as well as East Lake High School. So same situation, the city put in all the funds to improve the fields and rented those fields after school hours for both school districts. More recently, the Issaquah School District pulled out and decided to do things differently. They scheduled their own fields, and they also went ahead and made the improvements more recently at Pine Lake Middle School, as some council members mentioned, with no input of cost from the city. So you have a situation where your two school districts are doing things very differently. I will turn it over to Brian Buck in a bit to confirm this. But I don't think that the Lake Washington School District bonds have been inclusive of field improvements. Again, he can confirm, but I don't know if they had a bond that asked to improve the fields and it failed. I think their bonds have been very focused on the buildings only and have not included the field improvements. Brian, can you confirm that?
Yeah. So we go out for a facilities and technology levy every 4 years, and our 2018 facilities levy was passed. And that in that levy is capital costs for fields and field improvements. This project is not listed in the 2018 levy, but would be considered for the 2022 levy. Our 2018 bond, which was for school building, in new buildings and replacements and modernizations. That is the bond that failed back in 2018.
Thank you for that clarification. I have no other questions. I mean, I'm back to, I think if we get the longer use, which reduce our costs over time, sounds like we're heading in the right direction.
Thank you, Council Member. Okay, I just wanted to, two things. One, I'm going to stress again that looking at the Inglewood Middle School, again, this is one of the few places that we have on the north end. So that to me is a reason that it is important. However, we do need to keep in mind the bang for the buck. So, but I do want us to keep in mind that it is one of the very few places on that north end. So we do need to keep that in mind. And also about the Boy Scouts, I don't think we told them no. What we told them was that we do have limited opportunities with our school districts, but we try to work with them where we can. And I would hope that this would be one of the places that I would hope that the Boy Scouts and stuff would be knocking on the doors of the school districts, because this is exactly the sort of time that they should be involved in decisions like this. So the next up is Deputy Mayor.
Thanks. I have a quick question now that the gentleman from the school district just mentioned that in 2018 on their levy that they did have some capital projects and that there were field improvements, and I'd like to know what those were and where.
Yeah, I'd have to go back into the details on there. We have some Juanita High School field enhancements going on right now. Redmond High School field enhancements happened last summer. Timberline Middle School, we upgraded their track to a synthetic track when the cinders weren't available. I believe also at Redmond High School, we enhanced their track and field events areas. So those are the ones that are coming off the top of my head, but I could send you the lists that were identified out of our 2018 levy.
Okay, I'm curious because you just said that Englewood could be considered for next year's capital levy, which I'm not suggesting that you would necessarily put this in, but one of the improvements you just mentioned was at one of the middle schools that you did the very improvement that you are proposing to do as a portion of this project, which is the track. And while I understand that doesn't necessarily come with turf here, it is the track improvement that is a portion of this project. So.
Am I allowed to ask a follow-up question to Brian then as well? Because, so, Brian, you have the 2.2 million or so that the district will put in for the track at Englewood Middle School is your current standard. But if the city wanted the district to contribute towards the turf at either of the fields, would that be a possibility to include based on the district's current standard for schools at middle fields, at fields at middle schools?
Yeah, currently our standard for middle schools is like what you see there, which is a grass football field. And so that's our current standard. So unless we went back and reevaluated our standard and upgraded our standard and then went out for funding to replace that standard throughout our middle schools, that's what that would take. But currently this is what our standard is. It's a grass football field. And, middle school does not have baseball and softball any longer. For interscholastic sports. They do have soccer, but they do not have football any longer. But track and field and soccer are the primary field sports.
Okay, thank you.
Anjali, this is
Yes.
Chris.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask Brian, was because you guys just updated the fast pitch field at Eastlake. That was part of the levy, right? Because that was a new improvement. Was that?
I'd have to go back and check which year
Okay.
that was, but yes, our high school standard is a synthetic surface infield and a natural grass outfield with a synthetic surface foul territory and warning track. And so the softball field at Eastlake is that standard, and we recently upgraded that field accordingly. Whereas the baseball field at Eastlake, with the city partnership, is a full synthetic multi-purpose field, whereas our standard would be just a synthetic infield and a natural grass outfield with synthetic foul territory and warning track. And that standard is the current standard at Lake Washington High School.
Okay, is there any other questions?
Mayor, if at the end of the questions, I'm trying to tally here the comments from council, and I realize this is a study session, but just so staff can put our effort in the right direction, what I was hoping to get for some next steps, I know we don't seem to be at a point where, we are going to be deciding on one field or two fields or a lot, but what we need to know is, should we come back with some of the information Councilmember Gamblin asked, which right now is heavily pivoted on the city funds. I can say that without pulling together a matrix, that's how that would show, but we're happy to look at that in a little more depth. But then we also heard from some of you an interest in, let's look at Beaver Lake a little more, and then, compare the two before we decide to put a whole lot of money into either project. So we could do a similar exercise. It would take a few months, but it would help staff to know where you'd like us to focus our time. And I also just had Kevin pull up the slide to show, I think there was some question about fields at the north end versus the south end. And right now we do have less fields at the north end of the city. So just wanted to share that as well.
Okay, so let's, you know what, let's do a round robin, and I will go through each council member, and the first question will be, do you want to see, well, do you want a comparison, is it Beaver Lake or Inglewood? And the second question would be, tell me again the questions that you want answered so I can make sure that I get them into these questions for the round robin.
Yeah, the one question would be if we should look at Beaver Lake and do a feasibility and bring that back to you. And the second question would be, we could put more Englewood, we could put together the matrix, but is there anything else that council would like to see related to Englewood right now to help make the decision?
Okay.
Mayor, before we answer that question for Anjali.
Okay, go ahead, Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, so in asking if we want to do the comparison, if we do the feasibility study on Beaver Lake, is that going to just by default push this out another year because we will miss the window to be able to move on this?
That's what I was going to say, comparison to a yes or a no, or is it either or? Because to me, it's not either or.
Right. So I just want to be clear. So if we say we want you to go do the feasibility study on Beaver Lake, we will then be pushing this out by at least a year.
That is correct.
So I think that's a big deal. Just putting that out there, that we're going to get into sort of analysis paralysis here. Also, how much do we collect in revenues for these field rentals, and where is that factored in?
So we talked about it a little bit today. Jordan is the one that works on that piece, and he wants to be really conservative right now. So he said his conservative number would be roughly $60,000 per field per year. So that's about $120,000 for both fields. And then we have your maintenance costs are about, and today's dollars, approximately $30,000 per field. So it's about $60,000 for both fields together. For the ILA at the Eastlake High School, the cost for, like the electricity bill on the lights, that's the district's share of the maintenance cost. They pay for the electricity bills.
Okay, so these are the questions that I have. The first question is the Beaver Lake feasibility study, yes or no? And then the feasibility for the Beaver Lake study, does that mean it is a yes or no on making the decision for Englewood? A yes or no? Meaning you're willing to put off making a decision on Englewood for a year? Yes or no? And then the third answer is, what information would you want back on Englewood? And that could just be one or two certain things you want back. What information?
Mayor, I can save you one question and tell you that the Beaver Lake fields are on your CIP. And so if we are not waiting for a decision, if we're proceeding with Englewood, as we proceed with Englewood, we will be coming back later and doing a feasibility for Beaver Lake towards, I believe, later in the year. Kevin, can you confirm that? I believe it's on our CIP to start in Beaver Lake towards the end of this year or early next year.
We're intending to get it started before the end of this year.
So the question would be,
I guess the question would be,
do we want a feasibility on the comparison between the two? Is that really the question here?
Well, what we would do is a similar, like we've shown you here for Englewood, we do a similar feasibility for Beaver Lake and come back with options and costs. We wouldn't be, and that would be your comparison. You would know what your costs are to improve at Englewood, and then you would find out what it would be for Beaver Lake.
And it would delay Englewood by a year.
Correct. If we are to wait to do it. I was saying the one question we can save is that we will be doing, a feasibility for Beaver Lake regardless. It's in the plan. We just won't get to it right away. We'd get to it towards the end of the year. So the question is, do we want to hold off on making progress on the Englewood fields until we complete the feasibility for Beaver Lake?
Okay. So that is the question.
Yep.
Okay, do we want to hold off on making a decision on doing anything with Englewood until we do a feasibility? That's the question. Okay, so I'm going to go around and just ask every council member for that answer, so you have that answer to that question. Council Member Treen, yes or no?
Delay Englewood and do the feasibility on Beaver Lake.
Councilmember Ross?
Delay Englewood, do feasibility on Beaver Lake. And I should add, I'd like to see a third option for Englewood that's closer to standard. I don't know why we're trying to go above standard. I think we're over-financing Englewood. So if you could take a note that without lights, whatever the standard is, what would that cost? And can we arrange a partnership for a potential of doing both Beaver and Englewood, but having the investment priority being Beaver Lake?
Deputy Mayor?
Yeah, I like what Councilmember Ross just said about, what is the cost on a standard for Englewood Middle School, but I'm wavering on whether or not we push off Englewood and do the feasibility. I think we need the feasibility at Beaver Lake, but if I was going to do anything at Englewood, there's no way I would do option 2. And there's a couple of reasons. One, the cost is way too high, and 2, it's what the gentleman from the district said, which is they don't have softball, baseball, or football anymore, and we would be putting those fields in there and then self-limiting our community to using them until after 5 p.m. Whereas if we put those same investments into fields that could be used at a city park like Beaver Lake, then there's accessibility to those at more reasonable hours. I can tell you from having children that are of a young age, they start practices far earlier than 5 p.m. So I would not do option 2. That is not something that I am willing to throw my favor behind, but I might be willing to do option 1, but I would like some more answers to the questions that we've asked, especially on what does it look like for community use versus the school's use. And I get the benefit of having the children using it during the day while they're at school, but I'm not going to over-improve the fields that the school itself doesn't use. Softball, baseball, football, at a park that we're going to self-limit ourselves to. So I do think the feasibility is a yes. I could be convinced to do option 1, but I need more answers first. So I'm not saying that I'm going to delay Englewood at this point, but I want more answers before I can make up my mind. Oh, and one other thing that I want to throw out for council to consider is that when we put this pro plan into place, we did not have Beaton Hill Park yet, and we purchased that property for the exclusive reason to put fields there. I think we could fit 1, if not 2 fields there. So I just want to make sure everyone has that on their radar, and that is on the north side, that is in the Lake Washington School District.
Okay, Councilmember Gamblin?
Mine would be yes, delay the Englewood, look at the feasibility of putting these fields somewhere else. I don't think it's our responsibility to be improving the school district's property to this level. And if we want to look at a much lower level with some sharing of the expenses with the school district, we can do that. Thanks. Oh, it wouldn't hurt to see the matrix that I asked about. Thanks.
Councilmember Stewart?
I am not in favor of delaying. Our need for fields is high. We need to keep moving. We have money in our budget. We still have $420,000 for these field improvements from the last biennial budget that we haven't spent. I would also like to know more about the generation. If you're going to pull together more information, I think we need to get more information on what we would generate from the rentals, because don't we bring in like $600,000 a year on field rentals? That might be across the city, but I'm all for being somewhat conservative, but let's not be so conservative that the number just isn't even accurate. And with option 2, there'd actually be 3 fields we'd be renting out, not just 2. So I'd like to make sure that we include that. And just to note that while the Englewood Middle School doesn't have a football team, a baseball team, or a softball team, that's not to say that students at the school aren't playing soccer and softball and other things that would use those fields. And we would still be able to use those fields in the evenings, on the weekends, and when school is not in session for all of those purposes. So I think if we're putting together data, it should be, kind of a cost per usage type of number that we should look at. So how many hours of usage do we get for the cost, comparing that, and get some realistic numbers on how much our fields are used during the school days when school is in session, so that we have real comparisons there.
I am absolutely no delay. I mean, we've needed fields for 20 years, and we don't have enough on the north end. We're already behind. I do not think that the $10 million is the answer. However, I do think that there's probably an answer somewhere between the option A and option B. So, maybe it's a pared down version, maybe, there's something in between there. And something that is a little bit closer that fits into our budget and matches the numbers that we, for the kids that use it. And maybe, if they don't have a football team, we don't need the space, that is utilized for a football team. I don't know what that is, but I think that's something we could look into. However, I would be very much against a delay. So I don't know what that gives you. I think that still means we have a delay, I'm afraid. So were you keeping track of all that, Anjali?
I was, and actually I have 3 who clearly want to see a delay, but Deputy Mayor was a question mark, and then 2 who don't. So I think what we'll do is let's first just try and answer some of the questions you have and come back to you one more time. And, maybe that will change the priorities or not, but it seems split based on what I've tallied.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you for all the work.
Thank you.
Sharon, can we take a small break before we jump into that second topic?
Absolutely. Okay, let's do a Sammamish 5. Be back at 8:30.
Mayor, I'm happy to start if you'd like me to. Just let me know.
That would be great.
Great. Good evening. Good evening, Council. David Pyle, Community Development. I'm here tonight with members of the Development Regulations Phase 2 update team to provide an update on the process. I'm joined by Jeff Arango with Framework. He's the lead consultant on the project. Evan Fisher, who's a senior management analyst who's managing the project for the department, and Chris Hankins, a senior planner who's a content expert who's also assisting on the project. As you're aware, and in past conversations with the council, the department and the team had committed to returning to council periodically to provide an update as to where the project stands at distinctive points where we are shifting gears in the process. So we're here tonight to do that with you. There is no direct ask of the council aside from providing information, and if you see anything that piques your interest and have comments on it, we'd love to hear from you. Let me make sure I'm on the right screen. There we go. So as you recall, the Development Regulations Update Phase 2 project is focused on residential development. It does not include the town center. It is focused on the R zones shown in the yellow on the map primarily. It's primarily focused on rules for infill development, updating rules for subdivisions, adding design criteria, and adding minimum standards. The process utilized a community advisory group to help inform the topics. We held 4 virtual meetings. You can find these meetings, you can find links to these meetings on the project's Connect Sammamish page. You can actually watch the meetings if you'd like to. It was a diverse group that was purposely balanced on these topics. It included members from the development community, design engineers, design architects. It included citizens who had lived through the experience of being next to a project. And it also included citizens who had an interest in the outcomes of development and how it affects the community. The community advisory group served in an advisory role. It was not designed to provide formal recommendations or vote on issues. The community advisory group reviewed and provided early input that's really needed at that point in the process in order to help us scope out some of the issues. To start off with, we did
complete initial one-to-one interviews with each member of the community advisory group to help get a better understanding of their perspectives and some of the issues that they saw. Again, the focus of the community advisory group was framing issues and identifying potential code solutions to help the Planning Commission and the City Council do their work. The next step in the process, as I mentioned, we're checking in with you because we're shifting gears. So this project is now moving into the Planning Commission. Planning Commission will be tasked with refining the work done by the Community Advisory Group. The focus of the Planning Commission will be on the list of issues and solutions that is included as Exhibit 1 to tonight's agenda item. The next meeting the Planning Commission will hold is on March 4th, 2021. So any members of the public out there listening, keep that in mind. The next meeting on this topic will be March 4th, 2021. And the meetings will be scheduled through the spring with a public hearing tentatively scheduled for May 20th of 2021. So again, keep in mind that we have a pretty compressed work plan here, trying to get to public hearing and trying to get all of these issues addressed through code solutions. So focusing in on the issues and solutions list, which is included as Exhibit 1 to tonight's packet, the Community Advisory Group helped inform the list. It was assembled by staff and the consultants. Code drafting is underway on many of these topics, and there are still many issues on the list, as you can see, that require Planning Commission input. The issues and solutions themes generally fall in addressing a gap between permitted plan review and construction. And what this means is we are good at reviewing, we're pretty good at reviewing plans and seeing that the plan for construction meets our code. And we're pretty good at inspection. However, there's a gap between handing off a project from plan review to construction. So one of the focuses here is how can we adjust our codes to ensure that a project that is approved for construction that demonstrates on paper that it meets our code is actually what will be built. It's really important to us that we find a way to bolster our codes to improve this handoff so that applicants are successful, so the community knows what's going to be built, and so that what is on paper being approved is actually what is being built in the field. The next is to add teeth for enforcement during construction. One of the issues that we face is it's hard to affect change with the building community. And there's a culture that exists where builders may just ask for forgiveness later. And we really want to change that by adding some teeth to our code. That requires some amendments, not just to the development rules, but also to the code enforcement section in our code. The next is to state when connections to public infrastructure are required. We've been talking to the Sammamish Plateau Water and Sewer District, who happened to be a member of the Community Advisory Group, so it was great to have their feedback all along here. And we are looking at adjusting our code to reflect when we as a city, in cooperation with the Sammamish Plateau Water and Sewer District, want to require a connection to public services. It's really important. Our code doesn't, our code is, I'll say, unclear on that right now. And we have had many situations where we've had applicants feel they shouldn't have to connect, but yet they were, right within that distance where they probably should have connected, that type of examples. We want to be really clear about that. We want to amplify rules for infill development on vacant lots. And the issue here is that there might have been a lot that was left vacant for a number of years in a community, and the community built out around it and became accustomed to that area being vacant. And now suddenly it's under construction. There's traffic blocking the road. There's dust and noise. There are trees being removed, vegetation being impacted. And we want to clarify how our rules apply to those individual lots. In the past, we focused really heavily on subdivisions and how subdivisions are affected by the rules. So under this effort, we're also looking closely at how individual lots are affected with infill development. We want to augment criteria and design standards to guide outcomes. Our code has a really good backbone and skeleton for process, but what it doesn't have for residential development is a lot of design standards that go along with it. So we want to look closely at where value add can be achieved by adding design standards and helping get the outcome that we want. We want to eliminate permit requirements for small scale activity. This pertains to in addition of impervious to a driveway. This relates to how much disturbance on the ground requires a permit. And what we want to do here is set a clearer threshold for when a permit is required. Right now, it's unclear at times when a permit is required to do certain types of work in your backyard, for example, on a weekend. I just want to be really clear so that everybody knows when it's required, and when it is required, what the rules are. Also be really clear about what's exempt. We want to develop planning to development standards for flexibility when appropriate. This could pertain to, say, a larger project where it's really important to preserve community character and create a smooth transition around the perimeter of a large project. But interior to the project, it may not be as important to maintain that same type of character because somebody is buying into that neighborhood, so long as the community is buffered from what is internal to that division. The last one is to fine-tune settings of development controls. And this is one that we're constantly looking at, is do we have the right mix of controls and what is the setting? It's a really great conversation to have in the community to understand what the interests are. These are things like, to put it simply, building heights, floor to area ratios, lot coverages, setbacks. These are the types of things that ultimately drive the envelope of development. So again, taking a look at those and making sure that we've got it right when considered in concert or in conjunction with other tools that we have in the code. Again, the focus is single family R zones. Primarily titles 16 and 21A. 16 is the construction codes. 21A is basically, for all purposes, the zoning rules. We are not planning changes to the shoreline rules. The project was not scoped in budget or time to include that, and we did just complete our periodic update to our shoreline master program. Anytime you update the shoreline rules, it has to go back to the state for state approval, so there's a whole nother loop that's added there. That doesn't mean that we can't supplement the shoreline rules through additions to Title 16 and 21A. There are things that are ultimately implemented in the shoreline. They're not part of the shoreline rules, but that can be added under Title 16 or 21A. That goes the same for critical areas. This project was not scoped or budgeted in cost or time to include changes to the critical areas, and we are rapidly approaching the state mandated periodic update of our critical areas rules. So just wanting to make sure that we're doing that once, and we're being very deliberate about that when we do that. Again, we could also supplement those rules with Title 16 and 21A. No changes to the town center. That's not something that was scoped or budgeted here. We have not looked at that or talked about that with the community advisory group thus far. That would be a separate work plan. No changes to the public works rules and adopted standards. Again, this project was not scoped for that. And that doesn't mean that we can't supplement these rules in SMC Title 16 and 21A. However, we are not, as part of this project, looking at amending the stormwater rules, amending traffic concurrency or public facilities rules, or amending the city's public works standards as part of this effort. The next council engagement after this meeting and after a planning commission meeting would be June 3rd, 2021, which is when we are currently scheduled to come back to the council. With that, I'll turn it over to the mayor for a discussion. If you have any feedback on the list that's included as Exhibit 1 with the packet, or any of the points that were raised as part of this presentation, myself and the team are here to field any questions or receive feedback. The Planning Commission will, as previously stated, now be commencing with work on this work plan.
Okay. Well, it looks like Councilmember Treen is antsy, so we're going to get him first. Councilmember Treen.
Chris Ross was before me. Councilmember Ross.
See, you wrote development regs. Is that, or are you just?
Oh, I just showing the break.
Oh, okay. Then Councilmember Ross.
Yeah, thank you, David. One thing that occurs to me when I looked at some of your issues and solution themes, some are very hard to codify. What are some of the techniques and influencers to development to achieve those themes or objectives?
Yeah, so fortunately, we have a really great consultant assisting on this, and they've worked on development rules such as these in many different cities. Local consultants has a lot of awareness around Growth Management Act and some of the different options we have in rules. Really, I think it's about information we got from the community advisory group in terms of character, and character seemed to be a big theme with the group. And how do we maintain character? What are some of the things that we can do to start to turn out development that will blend in better? If for example, do we start? We currently don't have any sort of landscape buffer requirements for subdivisions along arterial streets, aside from the public works standards and the street tree treatments that would go along with that. So do we want to add landscape treatments in certain areas? Do we want to look at amending or adding some supplements to our tree rules that promote clustering of trees for preservation in certain areas in order to maintain character? One of there were a few divisions that were brought up, existing neighborhoods that were brought up with the group that were identified as successful projects where the character is such that it's seen as a good example of development. One that's a long-standing one in the city is Tree Farm. People in the community advisory group really like the way Tree Farm is laid out. Unfortunately, the complexity there is the densities. How do you achieve higher densities and still get that outcome? Another one is the Laurels, and how that was laid out and clustered. And actually, that was the first slide in my presentation, was a clip of the edge of the Laurels right up against some existing lower density development. So how do you achieve that transition? So what our consultant has done is looked at a lot of patterns, spent a lot of time driving around the city, looking at aerial photographs, seeing what is successful in terms of blending different generations of development, different architectural styles, and how does it all achieve the fabric that would be seen as the bedroom community of Sammamish. I think that's something we're working on. So it's a great question, and that's something we're going to also be asking the Planning Commission to assist us with.
Thank you.
Okay, next, Councilmember Treen.
Hey, David, I don't want to get too much down into the weeds here, but so the high, medium, and low ranking on the Exhibit 1. Can you explain a little bit of how that works?
Yeah, so the high ranking are an easy way to think of it is in terms of resistance for our success. A high level of resistance is something where it's going to take a little more effort, quite a bit more effort, to figure out a code solution. Those are ones that we're going to be initially embarking on our Planning Commission segment of this project and really ramping up with the Planning Commission, because we need feedback on those. Those are ones the staff don't readily have a solution for. We definitely are looking forward to further conversation with the Planning Commission on. The medium are ones that we think we know what might work. We have some ideas, but we want to take that to the Planning Commission and make sure we're going down the right path. The low are ones where we feel like we have a pretty good handle on how to make those changes in our code, where the problematic sections are, what code language might look like. So that's probably less of a priority to get in front of the commission right away. So that's the ranking, if you will, of the different topic areas.
So let me see if I understand this right by using an example. But if I were to look at, say, 14 and 16 on this list, which is also, I don't know why there's a double number right off the top of my head, but in the dark blue, you have 14 and 16 are low, and in between is the medium one. So what you're saying is that 14 and 16, you got a good understanding of how to fix that in the code and make it so that we can pay fines for violations, we could do stop orders. If a development is in conflict with the approved permit, you just don't sign off on the inspection, and so those are pretty easy to fix. That's what you're saying. Whereas the one in the middle is like, we're going to go to the Planning Commission and talk to them about, how do we do this management other than traffic management during a development.
Yes,
I get that. That is a little harder to address, right? And so then the red ones, I mean, a high one, is that something where, I guess my question is this where it's like we might not complete all of the task then?
We are committed to working through these. We feel all of the items on this list, and there are some other items that really don't even reach a low priority that are just sort of, we're going to fix them, that we already know here. They're not really worth raising here, but you'll see them down the line with the comprehensive matrix of changes that are being proposed. But really the focus right now with our conversations and feedback from the commission and hopefully public comment with the commission is those that are listed as high. The second priority is those that are listed as medium. And we really want to get to work on those so that we can be successful in the compressed time frame that we have. The good news is we have a good team supporting this. The council did us a favor by providing an adequate budget for it, and we feel like we're on track for success here. So, the next thing you'd be seeing is feedback from the commission, code solutions for all of these when we come back to you after the Planning Commission is done with their work on this.
And can I have the honor of just asking one more question? So, David, if this one is completely out of left field and just tell me that's for another day, that's for another conversation. So what I've noticed over time, just watching the city, is that a lot of our we have a kind of a really nice comprehensive plan, and maybe a little high thinking. Anyway, it's a good plan, but we often don't have the code that matches up to it. So in all of this high, low, and medium, are you actually accomplishing that goal where the code would match up to the comp plan? And maybe this isn't the right venue to talk about this, but that's my question.
So it's a great question. Does the code ultimately implement the vision established by the comprehensive plan? And what sections of the code are lacking in that, in its implementation? And we are not, to answer clearly, we are not doing a comprehensive gap analysis between the comp plan and the code here. However, what we will be doing when we bring this back for council consideration is we will have a comprehensive plan reference here as to what is driving this solution. Now, understanding that comprehensive plans at times can be inherently conflicting. There are statements within comprehensive plans that oppose themselves, right? So we will do our best to find policies in the comp plan that support our efforts here.
Would it be in our, so that leads me to another question, sorry. So does that mean that, would it be in our best interest as a council or in our best interest to direct the Planning Commission to look at past cases in front of John Galt to see where some of those gaps are? I know we're not doing the gaps, but to find, okay, here's a situation where the city was in front of the Galt and the results didn't go in our favor. And if we would have had this code in place, because we're doing a code adjustment, would have been got us a favorable ruling, then it would seem to me that we'd want to change that code or look at it at least to see if that is something that we could in this process change. Is that something that we would, as a council, would we be wise to direct the Planning Commission to do something like that? Do that kind of review for us?
So to be sure, phase 1 and phase 2, many of the issues that are on the list here and that were on the list with phase 1 come from our continuous inventory of issues raised during development, whether or not it ends up in an appeal in front of John Galt or whether it ends up as public comment in front of a John Galt as part of a public hearing for a subdivision. We do read all the comment letters that we receive, and we are aware of some of the challenges in development, dissatisfaction, outcomes that maybe weren't what we wanted in the community. And that is one of the reasons why we're doing this project. So I think it would be good guidance to them to have them work with staff to identify subdivision cases or other cases that where John Galt was hearing an appeal of an issue and try to figure out what the source of that was. And if there is a way, and in many instances, some of those are the source of neighbor conflict and dissatisfaction with each other. It just is part of the business we're in. But there are many instances where there was an issue that our code wasn't addressing, but that was really impacting someone's life, and or was going to impact someone's life with a project, right? Just in the way the project was designed. So I would say the answer would be, yeah, we should consider those.
Because part of my I have kind of two drives here right now that are going on, and one is that I'm looking for predictable outcomes, right? So what is being permitted or presented at permitting is going to be what actually is built on the ground. And then the second part of, so that's what we're looking for, correct?
Yes, and that's
I'm looking for.
That's done in two ways. One is making sure we have properly established criteria for permit approval, and second is making sure that we have the proper handoff to construction and the resources to ensure that contractors and builders are actually following the approved plan and that there's enough of a reason for them to follow it.
Right. And then the second part of this is for us as a council to give clear direction to the Planning Commission as to what our hopes are for what would be returning to us for policy. So So that is a challenge to us as a council to make sure that we have pretty clear directions as to what we need from the Planning Commission, so that when it comes time for us as a council to make policy and make good policy, that we have the kind of information that we need. Thank you very much for your time. Dave, thank you for your efforts. And if you want to add to that, no problem.
Sure. Yeah. The one thing that I want to clarify with this is it's fairly straightforward for us to analyze our code, look for gaps or deficiencies in criteria for permit approval. Like, what are we missing? Things like utilities, connections, the things that you can measure and you can calculate. The things that are a lot harder for us are setting design standards for character, because you can't put necessarily a numerical value on character, and that's a bit more of a challenge. And I think many of the ones that are high priority that are listed in this table are ones where we have more of a challenge trying to understand what the community really wants, and then the challenge is really in the code writing and how do you get the code tuned up so that the character outcome is what you want. So that's really where the challenge is here. On many of the other items, we can work through a numerical setting or add a fine or add a stop workage or all these things. We can do that. That's a proven course. We know how to do that. The other is more challenging. That's what I'm trying to say here.
Okay, next up we have got Councilmember Gamblin.
Okay, thank you. Hey, thank you for putting this together. It's quite detailed. So I just want to make a high overview, and then I'll get into a little bit, even though Councilmember Treen said he didn't want to get into the weeds. I'll drop down into the weeds just a little bit because I think we have some weeds here which need to be looked at. So, the high level is that as a council member, I represent the residents, okay? I represent their best interests. I never want to demonize developers. These folks are just trying to maximize their profits as they need to do to survive in the market. But they will, as a rule, only do what is in their best financial interest. So working by incentive may not be in the best interest of our residents. My thought is, and what I'm going to put forward is, why not codify incentives? If we really believe it is as is said in 4.2 here, if we want to improve design and work in the public benefit, I don't think we should be looking as much at these incentives, but rather mandates. So, you mentioned, David, a little earlier that we have gotten outcomes we don't want, right, in our process. And I believe, as you just mentioned again, these were caused by insufficient detailed and enforced codes. So how do we get to that point? So I'd like to look at just a couple of examples, and I'll tell you what I'm thinking, and maybe these can be looked at now. Maybe the planning department can look at them. So let's look at the matrix here. So if we look at the problem, 1-6 talks about shift the LID incentives to the new unit plan developments. Well, incentives generally, again, are not for sure, right? Let's eliminate incentives and make the LID requirements that we consider necessary required. Anything else is a giveaway. We're just giving it away, say, well, if you want to do it, we'll pay you a little extra to do the right thing. Well, we don't pay people driving on the road extra to follow the speed limit. We set the speed limit, and you're penalized if you violate it. So we can look at some other ones of these. If we look at Section 4, number 2, provides incentives in exchange for improved design and public benefit. I don't want to provide an incentive for a public benefit. I want to design as a council and say, what are the public benefits we want that the residents demand? And then I don't want to incentivize to that. I want to mandate to that. Because, again, what happens with incentives, in my experience, is if they make sense dollar-wise, maybe they get done. But many times they don't make sense dollar-wise, and they're not done. And so then how do we how do we codify what we really want to do? And as you said, how do we get the outcomes that we want, not the outcomes we don't want? Well, we don't get that by giving an incentive. We get it by writing the code, mandating the code we want, and then going ahead and making sure that we do that. So one of these things would be an example. You use this opportunity to redo setbacks and lot coverage. In phase one, it was watered down to nothing. So the more setbacks, the more smaller the homes, the bigger the lots, the more affordable homes we have. So I got a couple others. Let me just scroll down. So that was 4-2 I'd like to relook at. 7-2. Incorporate the LID incentives into new planned unit development standards. Eliminate incentives. Make LID required. Come up with the standards that we think are sufficient for our city as a council setting policy. Then go ahead and say, if you want to do business here, that's what you need to follow. Not incentivize you to do it, but this is what we need to do to make the city the way that the residents have indicated through their election of their representatives, and then we need to set that policy. So I would like to relook at like 7.2. Again, LID is very important, but why is it incentivized? Why isn't it mandated? Okay. 9.1, require financial guarantees. So this should be a high priority. Financial guarantees are okay, but not enough. Again, many times these financial guarantees and penalties are simply a cost of doing business. If you want to follow them, great. And if we penalize you, well, what's the cost-benefit analysis? It may be a benefit to the builder to ignore that and to go ahead and build what they want at a lesser cost because it makes sense for them to pay the penalty rather than to build the way that we want it to be built. That's a short-term problem for them, and it's a forever problem for the people who live here. So the residents have to live with the fact that the codes were not followed, trees were cut down, clearing was done, grading was done incorrectly, wetlands are filled up, and then they come back and we say, well, we're going to charge you for that. Okay, well, we budgeted that in, so it was worth cutting down the extra 60 trees because we got an extra house, we made X amount of dollars. I would like to propose that we put some teeth into this. Either make the penalty so enormous that you don't have a choice. I'd like to propose we have developers jail. If you violate these codes, you don't get to apply for a permit for 3 more years, 5 more years. Whatever we decide is sufficient, that they know going into this, listen, we got to keep those trees because if we cut them down, we can't apply for a permit in Sammamish for 5 more years. So we don't want to do that. So developers jail. It's something that I know when I was in the building trade, if I didn't stay on track and I violated, I couldn't come back to that city and do business there again when I had the opportunity. I'm damn well going to follow those codes. Okay? 10, 3, and 4, my input is, if we're talking about alley garages here kind of thing, I think that's a direction we don't want to go. We can talk about that in a little bit more detail. 14.2, developer reporting requirements, qualified professionals, verify compliance. Again, that's great. But what if the professional comes in and says, yeah, they violated. And so what? They built in an extra $600,000 to pay the penalty, but they got to build quicker and faster and made more money. Again, developers jail. Put them in jail. You can't apply for a permit here if you violate these standards because you have forever then reduced the quality of life for those who have to live here forever. That makes the city what it is. A person in doing business is just going to take their money and whatever's left after the penalty and go down the road on their merry way. God bless them, their business. I understand that. But the people who live here across the street who have to live with those 60 trees that are gone have to live with that forever. So the penalty should be significant and drastic when you want to do something like that. And I think it's happened a lot in this city. 16.1, again, we're talking about the ability to issue stop work orders and construction occurring. That's great. Again, okay, we had to stop for 2 weeks. We had to pay a penalty, but we got to build our job 6 months faster and we saved a bunch of money. Put them in jail. You can't get a permit here. So again, I don't know the legality of that. We'll have to talk to our legal experts, but the penalty has got to be greater than the benefit, or there's always going to be the benefit is taken financially. So anyway, David, I can talk to you a little bit further or get you more information on those thoughts. If you have any input on that, love to hear it.
Thank you. Great comments. Appreciate it.
Deputy Mayor.
Thanks. Sorry, I just needed to unmute myself. I'll try to be as concise as I can with some of my feedback. One of the questions I have is under number 1. It says item 2, and I understand and appreciate the need for getting folks off of a septic, especially when we're talking about steep slopes. But I did want to inquire. It says within 2 years, if available, within 200 feet of if the septic system fails. What is the cost? Can you just ballpark that so we have an idea? If someone's within 250 feet, 249 feet, what are we talking about for someone as far as cost to hook up to septic or to sewer? Excuse me.
So I think it varies dependent on whether or not there is a latecomer's fee. It varies on the type of connection that's required. It varies as to whether there's whether it's a low pressure grinder pump scenario. There's many scenarios out there. I've seen it as high as $50,000 for the connection, not including the actual trenching and construction of the connection. So it can be fairly high. But that's the question is about timing, because if you allow a new septic system to be installed or a rehabilitation of a septic system, then that system is in place for the life cycle again of that system. And we just want to be really clear. One of the things that we've heard from customers, those trying to build homes, and we often have, an individual who wants to move their family to Sammamish. They find a piece of land, hire an architect, an engineer, try and get a permit to build a house. And what they find along the way is that there are fees and other expenses that sort of creep up on you as you get closer to permit issuance, and what their initial budget is blown, right? And we want to be really transparent early on what those requirements are so that they can make a sound decision on purchasing land and not get themselves into trouble, so to speak. It's really important to us to be transparent about what all the costs will be with development. You can't always tell them right away up front what that is, but that's our goal. And trying to fine-tune these rules and working with the district, it will help us be transparent about what those costs might be.
Okay. And then in that same section, number 7, says in Tamarack and Englewood require drainage review for any residential unit, including an ADU. Remind me what the threshold is for drainage review in the Tamarack and Englewood, because I thought it was like 200 square feet. So any residential unit would already, unless you're building a really small footprint of a house, isn't it 200 square feet? Or is it 500?
I can't recall offhand. That's not a section of code that I would claim to have a lot of familiarity with, so I apologize. However, I think the point here is, some of the members of the community advisory group really wanted any change to require drainage review in Tamarack and Inglewood, and there's reason for that. I understand that. So what we're trying to do is find that balance point where we set a threshold for any level of impact. Could be 1,000 square feet of soil disturbance or vegetation removal that requires a permit. Then when the permit comes in the door, it's routed through Public Works, and Public Works can then evaluate whether or not drainage review is required based on the standards that we have today. One of the issues that we have is it's unclear when a permit is required and what the threshold for a permit is, and then we don't have the opportunity to route it through Public Works for drainage review. So if someone is doing work that seems to be outside of permit requirements, it's exempt, it's under the threshold, then there is no opportunity for us to evaluate it as to whether or not there should be some accommodation for drainage. I hope that makes sense, but what we're trying to do is catch all of those projects that cumulatively might add up to something in the end and ensure that our drainage rules are being applied. Whereas if you were to approach each of those small projects separately, you might be able to skirt around actually applying for a permit and not have to then go through drainage review.
Okay, so I guess then let me rephrase my question. Why just Tamarack and Inglewood? Because we have different thresholds for drainage review for Beaver Lake, Pine Lake, and landslide hazard areas. So why are we just targeting these two areas for drainage review for anything?
Yeah, no, that's great feedback. And if that's something we'll ask the commission to consider is, why not just design the rule in the city so that we're sort of catching these types of projects that might add up to something and they're being routed through drainage review.
Okay, great. I think Councilmember Redmond talked a little bit about the incentives, and I think I just want to understand what this is talking about when we're referencing the PUDs and providing incentives in exchange. I think those incentives, just for edification, it probably comes in the form of additional dwelling units. That's my guess. If you do X, then you might qualify for an additional unit. I guess I'm just trying to understand what it means by incentives in exchange for. Is that probably what the incentive is, or has that been discussed?
Yes, that's what an incentive would be. So the idea here is that we have a baseline set of standards that can be seen as a safe haven, if you will, for an applicant. Like if I meet these standards, I can predictably get a permit from the city, and the community will also see that as predictable. This will be what they'll build. But if someone wants to come in and go through a far more rigorous process, a PUD typically is design review heavy. It requires application of design standards. There's additional criteria. It ultimately would go to the hearing examiner. And what they can do is they can a PUD is supposed to be a superior product to what you would otherwise achieve through application of your zoning controls under a safe harbor sort of setup, right? So an applicant can choose when they come in the door to apply for a permit and know if they apply the baseline standards and they follow the rules, that they could get a permit to build their project. But and they could achieve, say, 10 units. But if they follow the PUD requirements and go through that process, which would include things like an open house with the community early on in the permit review, feedback, there's more community engagement, that they might be able to get, say, 12 units. However, there's a trade-off because the units might be smaller, the footprint's different, the landscaping different, the type of soil preparation's different, the drainage systems are different. It's more expensive to build, but in exchange for that expense, they get, say, 2 extra units.
Okay, gotcha. And then I couldn't make sense of, in that same section, which is section 4, number 3, where it says new development often does not provide an adequate buffer from the arterial streets with inconsistent landscaping, fences, and retaining walls that dominate the street frontage. Instantly, what pops into my mind is Highcroft, where we have the retaining walls, and then we have the trees that they kind of stuck, and then we have the fences on top of that. But I couldn't make sense of what it said for number 3 on the other side, which is develop criteria for preservation of open space beyond the minimum required. I was like, I could not make those two gel together. I think when I read number 3, what I think of in my head is type 1 landscaping or type 2 landscaping so that there is a buffer between the development and an arterial street of some kind. So, for example, in the Highcroft thing, instead of retaining walls, while there weren't trees in front there, they would have been required to plant trees, and then the houses would be behind the trees rather than seeing the retaining wall. So help me understand what develop criteria for preservation of open space beyond the minimum required has to do with the development on arterial streets.
So the numbers don't necessarily translate directly across.
Okay.
Item 3 in the right column under preferred solution is actually in response to item 2 on the left column, I believe, where it says new subdivisions do not fit the wooded rural character of Sammamish, do not use landscaping effectively to create a good fit with the surrounding neighborhood, and do not give residents a sense of privacy. So the idea here is that strategically placed open space that's designed properly. One of the things that the community advisory group said, those that voiced interest in it, about the Laurels was, and one of the things our consultant also found appealing about the Laurels is how it's wrapped in open space, and how it provides that buffer from the adjacent neighborhood. And I see Jeff has joined us, and he's been here all along, but he's turned his camera on, and I don't know if that's something you want to add, Jeff.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Good evening, Mayor and council members. I just wanted to give a little bit more context on this issue of open space because it's a really important factor for how development has been occurring in the city, and something we talked about at great length with the community advisory group. So for a new subdivision to come in right now, there is a minimum open space requirement per unit of about 390 square feet. But what is happening is developers are providing more open space beyond those requirements. And we think in part they're doing that because they're able to provide more open space in exchange for getting smaller lot sizes. So those smaller lot sizes, in some ways, I think, reduce the development costs, both by limiting the amount of roads that need to be developed, as well as the site development costs of the individual lots themselves. And so having more open space beyond what's required could be a really great thing, but there's really no policy or regulatory guidance for what that looks like. So I think oftentimes there's a question like, is this open space really providing community benefits? Is it just really there to reduce development costs? Where and how is that open space being provided? Like, is there smaller open space areas with trees that are sort of integrated into each block, or is it just sort of one area that's sort of isolated from the rest of the project? And so our thinking is that if developers are allowed to provide additional open space, and again, there could be lots of great reasons for that to happen and why that would be in the interest of the city, but there should be some guidance for why that happens and some trade-offs so that it's not just reducing development costs, but it actually is resulting in open space that starts to achieve some of those goals, for example, in the comprehensive plan.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. I think the only other question I have is there's a couple of code enforcement ones, I think 12 and 16. My curiosity is, especially with 16, David, is how often is the city imposing stop work orders and then people are violating those, or just being flagrant about not following code and knowing, well, I'll just pay the fine? How often? It's listed as a low priority. I'm assuming it's not a frequent occurrence, but I am curious how often it happens.
Yeah, so again, the way we ranked the priorities, so the priority was in terms of the Planning Commission needing to take the issue up first. Priority on this one, it's listed as low because we actually already have some very strong ideas about how to fix this problem. So it's not so much that it's a low priority for us to fix, it's just that it's a low priority for Planning Commission feedback, because we feel like we already have this pretty well in hand, that we understand what the fix needs to be. So just to be clear on that, I apologize if it was confusing as to how this table's laid out. We tried our best to show that, but sometimes it doesn't always get conveyed that way.
But how often does it happen? I mean, council enacted some pretty stout changes in 2015 on the tree code because developers were, somewhat strategically just building in the cost of taking out additional trees because the fines weren't very low. So we've now increased the fines pretty significantly. how often are we finding that people are just flagrantly violating code and or stop work orders?
So I think the most common scenario is where they didn't realize they were violating our code, or at least that's what we're told, and I have to believe there's a mix there. And we find that the code is not exactly clear about when we can stop work them and what the conditions are when that's allowed. And we really want to clean that up. We want to make it very clear that if you do X, Y, or Z, that results in a stop work. And we have the power to stop you for this much time. And, some of the feedback we got from some of the builders in the community advisory group was that stopping, especially a large project, is one of the best ways to get the attention of the builder, because it really throws off their entire construction schedule. There are so many sequential things happening that have to happen in lockstep that if you stop them, it really it impacts them down the line. Now, the smaller projects, maybe not so much. We actually have a problem with some builders that are single-family one-off builders that aren't from the city, that are building maybe 3 or 4 homes in the region, and they're hopping around from site to site, and the site will sit dormant for maybe a month and a half, and then they'll come back again, and that's a problem also. So it's the flip is we want them to we want to look at the construction administrative code and require that a project be active. And what does that mean, right? We want the minimal amount of time that a neighborhood is disturbed by construction. You start deliberately, you work deliberately, and you finish the project, so that this doesn't just remain active in the community, impacting people's lives for years on end.
Gotcha. Thank you. That was all I had.
Okay, Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, thank you. David, was there anyone on the advisory group that represented any of the environmental organizations?
In terms of local community organizations, or in terms of like the State Department of Ecology or something along those lines?
Either State Department of Ecology or I know we have some really great local environmental groups like our stormwater stewards and stuff, but I'm thinking more along the lines of an environmental organization that actually gets involved in looking at what kinds of codes we might want to enact to protect the environment and focus on sustainability and, kind of addressing climate change. So did we have anybody like that on this advisory board?
So out of the whole group, the people I could think of that we did have Mary Johnson, who is a resident of the Inglewood Hill neighborhood. We did have Mark Cross, who's past council member, typically has an interest in environmental outcomes in the city. We also had
I was thinking more formal, like a more an actual environmental organization, like not just people. Like I'm glad we had people who were very focused on the environment, and I think hearing from them is critical, and I'm glad their voices were heard. But actually, there are a lot of organizations that advocate at all levels of government for how to, what kinds of building codes or land use policies or transportation or a variety of things to really focus on the environment and sustainability. So I was just curious if we had anyone like that.
Not that I'm aware of from that angle.
Okay. So one of the things that I would ask for is making sure that we figure out a way that we can get that kind of input on the code, particularly when we're looking at things like redevelopment, and we're looking at some of that because, I would like to see us raise the bar for sure on our building codes to the extent that we can in terms of sustainability, right? Whenever we talk about development or redevelopment, putting anything in place, we have to be thinking about it's going to be around for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And so how do we make sure that we are protecting the environment and creating something more sustainable? So I would love it if we could figure out a way to kind of look at it that way. And I think that's where using both the carrot and the stick method will probably yield better outcomes, right? I'm all for raising that min bar for what we want from environmental standards perspectives. And, if you look at a number of cities where they're enacting that, I think Kirkland is really leading the way in some of those areas. I know that there are some efforts going on just in building codes in general at the state level. But if you really look at what can we do around protecting the environment and creating more sustainable houses and more sustainable properties, let's raise the bar, that min bar, but then let's also find ways to provide incentives to go above and beyond that. And it doesn't always have to be adding additional units, right? I know people are worried about density, and we don't always have to be increasing the density. Sometimes it can be something small where we can give them, maybe a little bit more height if they're willing to do some environmental change, right? I mean, there are a lot of things that we can incentivize people with to go above and beyond from an environmental standpoint, because some of the min bars that we can put in place are limited by the state regulations, right? We can't always go above and beyond in certain areas, but that doesn't mean we can't incentivize people to go above and beyond. So that's where I would think that we could do more there. And I think that some of the discussions around like septic to sewer are perfect examples where we might be able to find ways to incentivize people, where you have somebody who might want to move to the sewer, but it's super expensive. And so they're going to maybe look at staying on a septic, but we know that from an environmental standpoint, that may not really be the best course of action. Are there ways that we can incentivize, or are there organizations we can find that might be able to help with grants or something like that? And so I would love to see us do something in those areas, because, again, a home that could get connected to the sewer, but instead puts in a brand new septic tank that's going to last another 30, 50 years, right? That's a long time. So those are just some of my thoughts in terms of how we can focus on getting those desired outcomes. I hear you talking a lot about character, but I would hope that we are far more concerned about our lasting impression on the environment, the sustainability, and how we can move forward to positively affect the climate crisis as opposed to continuing to contribute to the climate crisis. So there's almost an infinite possibilities of building codes and things we can do in terms of building homes that make them, much more sustainable, have much fewer, greenhouse gas emissions, much more energy efficient, all of those types of things. And I think that is an excellent place to find ways to utilize incentives. Because, again, it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that we are potentially limited in how high we can raise that min bar in some of those areas. Is that correct?
So to be clear on this project, the good news is that a lot of what you're talking about is directly aligned with character. So trying to minimize disturbance to sites, trying to fit things into the existing landscape is also in minimizing an environmental footprint. What is the impact that goes along with it? Now, what this project has not considered, and where we haven't gone, and largely this is due to scope, timing, budget, all that, is really diving into the building code and requiring things like green building standards, like passive heating, solar, construction types, those things that are building related, aside from zoning controls, we really have not considered, and I don't believe we have the right time to do that and budget to do that with this project. We'd be happy to include that as phase 3, and I think it would go really well with it. However, given the scope of what we have always had in front of us, those are items that we just have not included thus far in development of the work here.
Okay. I do want to just throw something out there, too, that, and I'm glad, when we look at, minimizing disturbance, I think that's great. I just want to throw out, though, that, having more setbacks in smaller homes on on the same lot size is not going to lead to more affordable housing, because it's my understanding that generally right now the property values are driving the prices far more than the size of the home. So I think we need to make sure that we don't get those two things conflated. I guess the only other thing is, I'm big on carrots and sticks. So I think incentives are good. I think it's fine to raise that minimum bar and then to use incentives to drive people to go even further. I'm fine also raising, penalties so that it isn't, I know that from a pollution standpoint, that's always been a challenge where companies would prefer to pay the fine than to clean up their act. So I think where it makes sense to make sure that the penalty actually discourages the bad behavior, I'm definitely supportive of that. But I'm not sure that developer jail is really the way we want to go. I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to yield better outcomes. I think that there are better ways to get there, but appreciate this work. Wherever we can fit more environmental and sustainability, not just, lack of disturbance, but really focusing on how we develop in more sustainable ways, in my mind, is really, really important, right? Because again, whatever we're doing is going to be around for a long time, and we don't necessarily have that long to change the course on the climate crisis.
Thank you for the comments.
Yeah.
Okay, David, then my comments are pretty quick. One, a lot of the folks from the Water and Sewer District have got different ties to different environmental agencies. So if you're looking from somebody from one of the different environmental agencies, they would be, just ask them if one of them is available, and if anybody belongs to one of them, that would be a good choice. They also can tell you they know all the financing plans for Seward and get people on them. That's what they do, and all that stuff is available through the Water and Sewer District. And I wanted to go back to, I think it's 7. I have it in my notes here, which is where we specifically call out for Tamarack and Inglewood. I don't like to be calling anything out in particular. I think if we're on slope, or if it's a neighborhood of that particular era, but then we call them all out from that era. We call them all out for being on slope. We call, anybody out who doesn't have the right type of drainage, whatever it is. But to be calling just specific areas out, then we're probably missing some. And I don't want to do that either. So those are my comments. And
great, thank you. And we've been.
Oh, go ahead.
We've been very thankful for the time that the Sammamish Plateau Water and Sewer District has spent in engaging with us on this. I think we've had some great information exchanges, and I've learned quite a bit from them. So again, I want to just go on record appreciating their engagement.
Great. Yeah, they're a good bunch. I don't see any other questions in the chat box. Okay, seeing none in here. Thank you. That was a great presentation.
Thank you for the feedback. I'm definitely going to watch this tape and extract a little more out of it than I was able to write down here. So thank you for all the commentary.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, good job.
Okay, so the next up this evening, we've got our public comment. And public comment on this meeting's agenda topics may be submitted in writing or verbally at the meeting. Pursuant to the Governor's Emergency Proclamation 20-25, the city is unable to provide an in-person location for the public to listen to the virtual City Council meeting this evening. Meetings are still accessible to the public, and public comment is able to be submitted. Written public comment will will be accepted until, 5 p.m. on the day of the meeting. Submit your written comments by email to the city clerk at lhatchie@sammamish.us and the city council at citycouncil@sammamish.us. Up to 3 minutes of verbal public comment may be provided per person live during the meeting. Call the following number, input the access code when prompted by 6:30 p.m. the day of the meeting. The phone number, 1-571-317-3122, with the access code of 929-348-197. Mike?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I see we have 4 people who have called in for a public comment this evening. I will unmute the callers in the order in which they join the meeting, and when it is their turn, they will hear an automated voice say unmuted, and then they will have 3 minutes to provide comment. 15 seconds before your 3 minutes is complete, I will provide a time warning. At 3 minutes, you will be muted. Please start your comment by stating your name and the city you live in for the record, and I will now go ahead and unmute our first caller. Caller number 1, you have 3 minutes. Oh, and it looks like the caller dropped off, so we'll move on to our second caller. Caller number 2, you have 3 minutes.
Hi, this is Mary Wichter. I've lived in Sammamish 20 years. For the Phase 2 development regulations, I first wanted to thank the very experienced and excellent staff because they've been doing a lot of really fine work and a lot of effort, and there's been terrific consultants, including Jeff and a second one as well. Tonight, what I wanted to do is there's going to be a lot of work done in legislative sessions at Planning Commission, but I wanted to put forth what I felt was truly excellent guidelines when this was discussed last year because there was an objective set by the Planning Commission and 2 litmus tests, and I wanted to add 3 more. So the objective set by the Planning Commission, and I paraphrase here, but I sent in an email so you can see it, is the objective is to improve the outcome of housing being built in Sammamish to be more in line with community expectations and character. And to do that, you need to ask for the first litmus test, does the topic or proposed change create the potential to improve housing stock in ways the community looks to see it improved? And then the second litmus test, which was from staff, was does the topic or proposed code change provide missing or necessary tools to help staff influence the outcome through the permit review process, plus improve the clarity and usability of the city's code to all users? I want to ensure that you understand for the litmus test that these would apply regardless if the drainage review is required or not, because we're not changing stormwater code at this time, but a lot of times there are things where stormwater code is not, the drainage review is not triggered, so they need to be available through the other code in the city. So a third litmus test I would recommend, even though David Pyle said we're not doing critical areas or shorelines. He said that they could do things in 21A and Title 16 to have more stringent requirements in the context of environmentally sensitive or critical areas and shorelines than just what is required for flat or cleared lands. Because if you don't do that, you don't protect those areas. And hazards include erosion, landslides, steep slopes, seismic, which are geologically hazardous areas, critical aquifer recharge areas or CARs, wetlands, streams, fish and wildlife habitat corridors, or conservation areas, and you should also consider native growth protection easement areas, trees, forests, and vegetation. A fourth litmus test would be related to single-family homes, that the changes or code would address any missing requirements or increase the application of things plat-type regulations get, or extend changes for new or existing that must really apply to any single-family home, whether they're building on a vacant lot, replacing, remodeling, or if they're redeveloped. This is because 95% of the city is single-family home. And for the fifth one, the litmus test is make sure that the city code is at least as effective as prior adoptions of King County or other cities like us in requirements, and that there are no gaps. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Moving on to our third caller. Caller number 3, you have 3 minutes.
James Easton, Sammamish, Washington. I know we're not supposed to swear in public comment, but since the deputy mayor already mentioned the word Highcroft, I thought I'd also bring it up. I was actually looking at it today, and you wouldn't think, but when you actually measure everything out on Highcroft, there's 10 acres that have been undeveloped or saved as tract land, and there's 20 that were developed. So you think, wow, 10 out of 30, that's not so bad. But then you look at the reasons why we think it's bad. Why do we hate those retaining walls right up against 228? Why do we hate seeing the back of those houses that all look the same? Why do we hate that the trees are gone? Well, it's because of the way it makes us feel. And so, what would we give to have that feeling be gone? If we took 7 of the acres away out of that open space tract and put some trees up along 228 and spread them out in Highcroft and took all the houses that are minimum setbacks all the way across the board and increase them and increase the lot size, would we feel better? I think we would. That's all, that's like the prime example of what we're trying not to do. And I think what happened there was somebody just went down and checked all the check boxes with the code and said, it complies, without really giving thought to how it makes you feel and, how it makes people feel in the city and what we value. So I really I'm glad we're taking the time on this one. The development code part 1, we kind of had to slam in there, and 2, we committed to taking the time. And I want to remind everyone there's not a ton of developable large parcels left in the city. Most of it is going to be infill. And this is going to probably be really touchy, and if we're not careful, it can have the domino effect where somebody just checks all the boxes, and all of a sudden their 1 acre lot is now 3 very small houses at minimum setbacks right next to a guy's house that's on an acre farm, that is looking out his window and seeing a guy without a shirt on going to the fridge. We've already heard that, right? So these are going to be unintended consequences that we're trying to prevent. And with a very specific code, I think you're going to get unintended consequences no matter what you do or what you try to think of, because you're not going to be able to think of everything, and unintended consequences are going to come up. So I would like to look outside the city, look at places like Seabrook, Issaquah Highlands. We should look at stick framing roofs, let people go above the height limits if the setbacks are better, and also look at distinct elevations on the fronts of houses to match the neighbors. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
And rolling along to our last caller. Caller number 4, you have 3 minutes.
Good evening, Council. Paul Stickney here in Sammamish. I've watched the 4 stakeholder meetings, have been following the code, studied carefully what's in the packet of roughly the 45 problem statements and 70 solutions. And in general, it's my opinion that this overall approach is going to have some increase in lot size and return future subdivisions and plats and one-on-one construction more into how things were sort of before 1990. And I think that's what a lot of people in the community want. What's not here, and was mentioned in a couple of the Citizen Advisory Committee meetings, though, is some hard facts, information, get the data. And reading from my fairly short email I sent today, I think it would be important. Here are 2 suggestions. 1, I think that the new development codes should have 2 sets, if you will. One is a set of regulations that applies to R1, R4, and R6, which is roughly 11,000 acres in the city. And another set that applies to R8, R12, and R18, because that is a completely different kettle of fish, but is only about 300 acres in the city. Second suggestion, I think it's really important to get specific information and numbers on the number of parcels in the city. 2 sets of criteria, 1 for 1 and one for more than one. The one for one means when somebody comes in to reconstruct or remodel an existing house, there's no new lots created. How many of those types of parcels are there in the community? And the one that has real interest is the one for more than one. How many parcels are there in the city, either vacant or with the existing structures, that could be further subdivided into more than one lot? I really think that's important information to have, because if there's only 5 or 10% of all the parcels in the city that can have more than one lot, that's one thing. If it's 20 or 30%, it is another. So I would suggest getting that information, adding it to your overall analysis of this code. Okay? Have a good day.
Thank you.
That is all for public comment.
Great. Okay. Thank you to our callers. And we have no executive session this evening. Do we have anything for the good of the order? Okay, Council. Then I believe we are dismissed. We'll see everybody next week.
Which we verify. Is there any questions on that?